Central Texas, January 23, 1871. Amidst the rolling landscape that surrounds them, on an isolated strip of cattle trail, 3 working cowboys ride west from the town of Weatherford. They are on their way to the ranch of Brit Johnson, better known as Brit Johnson, who rides at the head of the group. They intend to gather Johnson's cattle and make a return trip to sell them in Weatherford. With Johnson are Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford. All 3 men are known and respected locally for their skill as cowhands and their dealings in business. They are all also ex-slaves, officially made American citizens and given their freedom less than a decade earlier. However, despite the tenuous state of the nation in the Reconstruction era, Brit Johnson has built a reputation amongst all peoples of the area as a forthright and upstanding citizen, as well as a local hero. 7 years prior, in the summer of 1864, while still under the bonds of slavery, Johnson had been commissioned by his then master to travel to nearby Parker County to procure supplies for the ranch. Brit Johnson had left his wife and young children with the Fitzpatrick family, trusting that they would be safe from the incessant Comanche and Kiowa raiding that plagued the area at the time. Upon his return, Johnson was met with the horrifying news that the small neighborhood he and his family called home had been laid waste to. His son, Jim, and several members of the Fitzpatrick family had been murdered, and the rest of his family had been kidnapped by Comanche and Kiowa raiders. He had secured written permission from his then master to travel alone on the frontier, a legal necessity at the time, and then ventured out on his own in search of not only his family, but the surviving members of the white Fitzpatrick family as well. After months of tracking, and subsequently working his way into the good graces of the tribes, Johnson had been able to negotiate trades for the return of not only his family, but all of the surviving members that had been taken in what came to be known to history as the Elm Creek Raid. Some members of the tribes, though, regarded his dealings as being underhanded and self-interested, as he had reportedly absconded with more rescued captives than the Kiowa and Comanche had agreed to. Thus, some warriors of both tribes vowed that, should the opportunity ever arise, they would take their retribution on Brit Johnson. Now, 7 years later, Johnson pulls his large horse to a halt, as the men set out to make camp for the night. The trusted steed has been with him since before he ventured out alone in search of his family, and is not only a trusted workmate, but a treasured companion. Scampering around the horse's feet, Johnson's small dog greets his owner as he steps from his saddle to the ground, whimpering and excitedly wagging his tail. Though the scene might appear akin to that of a relatively placid modern-day trail ride, the situation at hand is anything but. Though considerable time has passed since the Elm Creek Raid, hostilities between settlers on the Texas frontier and the mighty Comanche and Kiowa tribes still rage, and any territory between towns and homesteads is considered to be dangerous ground for travelers. All 3 men, though, are seasoned hands at both working cattle and fighting hostile native tribes. Thus, they carry about their work of setting up camp for the night with a workmanlike deliberation that, to the outside observer, seems wholly untroubled by the potential danger at hand. However, all 3 men are also heavily armed with repeating rifles and Colt revolvers, a necessity in this territory. They also carry hundreds of rounds of ammunition. As the men finish making camp and prepare to bed down for the evening, they notice another group of working cowhands hauling freight to Weatherford, camped roughly a mile and a half away. Thinking themselves to be relatively safe for the night, the men soon drift off to sleep after consuming a cold supper. The next morning, January 24th, arrives with the typical merciless chill that plagues the country throughout the winter. As the morning sun begins to peek over the horizon, Brit Johnson, Dennis Cureton, and Paint Crawford rise and begin to prepare themselves and their horses to move on for the day. However, just as their thoughts begin to drift to preparing breakfast and what the day's travel might hold, the 3 men in the small camp are startled by the sickening sound of thunderous hoofbeats cutting through the morning stillness. Looking in the direction of the sound, the 3 men see an oncoming cloud of 25 Kiowa warriors, bearing down upon their encampment at full speed. The Kiowa are in the area conducting raiding on local homesteads when they have spotted Brit Johnson and company the day prior. Seeking to make good on their old promise of settling their score with Johnson, they now charge upon the camp in full regalia, their war whoops intermittently piercing through the thunderous cacophony of their horses' hoofbeats. Though a completely separate and much smaller tribe than their allies in the Comanche, the Kiowa are just as renowned in this territory for their bravery, horsemanship, and ruthlessness. While the Comanche are known for their Spartan-like ornamentation, though that has begun to change in the latter 19th century, the Kiowa possess a far more complex cultural tapestry of dress, religion, economics, and social structure. The Kiowa that now charge upon the camp are more ornately dressed than their Comanche counterparts, but their tactics, once familiar to Johnson, Cureton, and Crawford, are drawn from the same well of knowledge and experience drawn upon by the Comanche, as well as other Plains tribes. Rather than a head-on charge at the cowhands' campsite, the warriors maneuver forward in a whirling cyclone, in which the rider nearest the target fires his shot, before continuing on to the back of the circle to reload and return for another shot. The whirlwind of bullets and arrows soon encircles the entirety of the small three-man camp, which provides no cover to its inhabitants. Now, the once placid campsite is engulfed in the storm of violence, as all three men scramble for any semblance of cover they can find. They pour fire from their rifles into the thick oncoming Kiowa formation, loosing dozens of rounds in little more than a few minutes. However, essentially caught in the open, Cureton and Crawford are quickly cut down by Kiowa bullets and arrows. With no other options at hand, Brit Johnson draws the large bowie knife he keeps in a scabbard on his belt and, after a heart-wrenching few milliseconds, dispatches his beloved horse with the large steel blade. The hulking animal falls where it had stood, and Johnson takes what sparse cover he can find behind the animal's corpse. Now, aside from his small dog, Brit Johnson is the only remaining member of the camp left alive. From their vantage point roughly a mile and a half away, the team of ranch hands hauling freight to Weatherford can only watch as the fight unfolds, afraid of drawing the much larger Kiowa force's ire upon themselves. They watch, awestruck, as Brit Johnson now fights for his very life in a battle that he very likely knows is lost. However, Johnson fights on with the fury of a man possessed. In a momentary lull in the attack, he scrambles to the bodies of his comrades and procures their firearms and ammunition, before retaking his position behind the body of his horse and continuing to pour fire into the ranks of the Kiowa. With seemingly robotic efficiency, Johnson continues to fire and reload, methodically picking off his attackers as the relentless succession of charges continues. No one can know what thoughts crossed the mind of Brit Johnson during these lonesome, fearful moments. It is a safe assumption, however, that the memories of his beloved wife and children, now only a few dozen miles away, flood his mind. So too might have the memories of his time with the tribes, the killing of his son, and the promises of the disaffected warriors to exact their revenge. Though no one can know his thoughts in his final minutes, Brit Johnson's actions now become the stuff of Texas legend. As the Kiowa warriors dart around him like a swarm of enraged hornets, Johnson gives no quarter and asks for none. Shot after shot rings out, deafening all within earshot as the ground seems to quake with the rumble of the horse's hooves. Finally, though by what means we are unsure, Brit Johnson is struck by either a bullet or an arrow and dealt a mortal wound. Though the onlooking men of the freight-hauling detail are unable to discern the moment at which Johnson is killed, they witness the Kiowa swarm his position and know that all is lost for the brave lone cowboy. Hours later, they venture forth to the site of the battle, assured the Kiowa have now left the area. What they find bespeaks a fight and an aftermath that, even on the bleeding edge of the Texas frontier, was unique in both its brutality and its ruthlessness. They find the bodies of Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford where they had fallen, the tops of both their heads freshly scalped. They see the body of Johnson's horse, prostrate in its last act of service, riddled with bullets and pin-cushioned with arrows. Behind the body of the horse, they find Brit Johnson. He has been terribly mutilated, with his face gruesomely disfigured, scalped, and eviscerated. So too has the body of his small but eternally faithful dog, found shoved into Johnson's torso. However, in a testament to Johnson's commitment to fight until the end, 173 cartridges are found scattered around his body. To the men investigating the site, and in the eye of posterity, this is a near unbelievable amount of firepower for one man to have unleashed during a fight that was all but assuredly lost before it even began. In the end, the bodies of Brit Johnson, Dennis Cureton, and Paint Crawford are buried in a common grave next to the road near which they fell. A small marker with all three of their names is left at the spot, which is today marked by an official Texas Historic Site marker. Though he was not afforded a major affair for a funeral, and was meant to suffer some of the worst indignities wrought upon American citizens within its tumultuous history, Brit Johnson is remembered as a Texas legend and an example to all of what selflessness, determination, and bravery really mean. For their part, the Kiowa would go on to retreat to the northwest, to the vast open plains. Here, they would again join forces with the Comanche in the ensuing 4 years in what would come to be known to history as the Red River War. This war would ultimately spell the beginning of the end for both the Kiowa and the Comanche, two powerful tribes that had been ravaged for decades by warfare and disease. But the many tales of the Red River War, as well as the full story of Brit Johnson's one-man ventures to reclaim his family, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. South Kingston, Rhode Island, December 19, 1675. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, an army of over 1,000 Puritan English settlers with more than 150 Mohegan and Pequot allies marched through whipping winds and snowfall across an ice-encrusted swamp towards a fortification of thousands of Narragansett warriors, tribal elders, women, and children under the leadership of their sachem, Comanches, who English leaders would refer to as a most perfidious villain. The contrasting civilizations were on the precipice of one of the most horrific scenes to take place in all of King Philip's War. But first, how did it come to this? June 20th, 1675. On this day, Philip, otherwise known as Metacomet, a Pokanoet chief and sachem from the Wampanoag people, began a bloody and barbarous conflict between a coalition of native tribes loosely assembled under his vision against the New England Confederation, comprised of the Puritan colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and New Haven. The Puritan colonies had adopted this confederacy to create a defensive force against the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, as well as the native tribes of the northeast region. Philip had come into power after the death of his father Massasoit in 1662. While Massasoit and his people had a relatively peaceful relationship with the settlers, assisting them, trading, and cohabitating the land, Philip's reign would mark a decidedly different approach. The crux of this change in diplomatic relationships can be traced to the treaty proffered by the colonists to the natives in 1671, which included the conditional surrender of all native arms. The English settlers sought to expand their security and dominion over an area in which they were vastly outnumbered through these escalating demands built into their treaties. The terms had damaged the relations between the sides, and the forcing function would finally occur in the spring of 1675, when 3 Wampanoags were hanged in Plymouth for the murder of a member of their own tribe. Hostilities would officially commence one fateful day in late June, a date tribally significant due to the summer solstice, when a band of Pokanoets raided several rural homesteads in Swansea in the Plymouth colony of what is now present-day Massachusetts. These attacks would continue for months, with fierce fighting amongst colonists and natives taking place, as atrocities were committed as acts of retribution from one side to another again and again. The New England colonies would draft an ever-increasing contingent of men into service for the defense of their interest, and would align themselves with Mohegan, Mohawk, and Pequot natives. In October of 1675, Massachusetts Bay Colony held a diplomatic meeting with Comanches, the sachem of the Narragansett tribe, and they signed the, quote, Treaty of Neutrality. The tribe had sought to remain impartial during the conflict, However, repeated visits from Pequot sachems who endeavored to gain the involvement of Narragansett warriors in the war and their precariously close location to Puritan settlements brought great angst and uncertainty to the colonists living amongst them. In early November, Governor Josiah Winslow would lead a contingent of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut militia against the Narragansett tribe, burning their villages as they marched through Rhode Island, driving the Narragansett east towards the shore. The Narragansett had been found to be harboring refugees from the belligerent Wampanoag tribe of what is today eastern Rhode Island, and the colonists demanded they be turned over to them. After several rounds of start and stop deliberations, the Narragansett ultimately declined the colonists' request. Stonewall John, the Narragansett leader, then broke off peaceful negotiations with the colonials. His name, ironically, did not come from his style of diplomacy, but rather his incredible skill as a mason. On December 15th, after the dissolution of treaty talks, the Narragansett attacked the Giray Bull blockhouse, a fortification constructed of stone. 15 soldiers who were defending the fort would perish in the attack. 3 days later, on December 18th, the night before the Great Swamp Fight, had arrived. It was a cold, bleak, and snowy night. Divisions from Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut of the New England Confederation joined together at Pettaquamskin, below Tower Hill, near the water's edge. The Massachusetts and Plymouth units marched through Richard Smith's trading post upon the way, using the harbor that was there to mobilize food, munitions, and supplies for the campaign. The Massachusetts counted 500 men, including a cavalry of 70 mounted soldiers. The Plymouth counted 150 men. The Connecticut added 300 Englishmen along with 150 Pequot and Mohican native auxiliaries. This substantial force of more than 1,000 was not made up of pacifist settlers. It was a hardened band of men who had seen vicious combat, some of which was gained during previous battles during the still young King Philip's War. The force also included veterans of the astonishingly fatal English Civil War. Narragansett scouts had made the presence of this mobilizing force known to their people. They also reported that it was growing in number and positioned dangerously close. It was made clear to the Narragansett that the mission of the New Englanders was to ratify a treaty with the Narragansett that would keep them out of King Philip's War. The people of Rhode Island, aware of the bloodshed that had been taking place throughout New England in this conflict, became increasingly uneasy about the large Narragansett population so close to theirs. While small skirmishes had taken place amongst the New England companies and the Narragansett, they would pale in comparison to the coming Great Swamp Fight. The critical intel needed by the New England militia to take action was the exact location of the Narragansett. While at Wickford, Rhode Island, a small settlement in North Kingston, the English captured and interrogated a Narragansett native. Under threat of death, the Narragansett revealed the whereabouts of his people. The Narragansett believed swamps made for ideal locations to take up defensive positions. With their natural conditions designed to bog down an advancing force, they had built a fortification within the Great Swamp near South Kingston, Rhode Island, south of Narragansett Bay. Just before dawn on December 19th, a bitterly cold morning, the colonial force made their way to the Great Swamp, led through the snow by the Narragansett saboteur who had informed them of the location under the threat of execution. Had the scout not led them through, it would have been nearly impossible for the New England regiments to come upon the site of the Great Swamp fortification. Through the early hours of the day, the men marched over Tower Hill, across the Chepuxet River, heading for the Great Swamp. The conditions were so frigid that several of the men began to freeze, and had to be carried back to the site of their encampment. While the inclement conditions were a hindrance to the men on their journey, they would play a fateful role in allowing them to cross the Great Swamp, as the frozen march allowed them to travel with comparative ease to the conditions of the locale throughout the rest of the year. The discovery of the swamp being frozen lifted the spirits of the men, and shifted the strategy to that of one of immediacy, accompanied by a more aggressive tone. Narragansett scouts opened fire upon the men as they spotted them in the woods near the swamp. Several skirmishes broke out, and the New Englanders fought their way to the opening of the Great Swamp. The men finally laid their eyes on the fortification. Large, upright cedar posts anchored the structure. reinforced with banks of clay, brushed up into the timber like grout. Just in front of the fort were piles of brush stacked up as a breastwork, and large trees laid end to end. Captain Mosley and his Massachusetts company were in the front of the column, and rushed after the retreating Narragansett scouts, pursuing them to the opening of the fort. The Massachusetts men were met with a resounding fire from the entrenched Narragansett's flintlock muskets, which were used with lethal accuracy, as well as torrents of oncoming arrows. Fierce fighting continued, and the militiamen from the Old Bay State took heavy casualties as they drove forward into the endless fire of the warriors. The men were driven back into the swamp, and Captain Mosley, who was known to the warriors from previous engagements, would tell the governor after the assault that he saw 50 warriors aim at him through the course of the battle. Governor Winslow, the acting general of this colonial force, ordered the Connecticut to charge forward and support the pummeled Massachusetts column. A narrow opening in the front of the fort was the target of the advancing colonials, with it viewed as the weak point by the men as they locked eyes on the fort. It had in front of it a single large tree, laid on its side as a blockade, but the tree held little efficacy in stopping the English from getting to the front of the structure. Amidst the blistering pace of action that had now overtaken the once serene winter terrain, the fighting moved in around a series of tightly placed wigwams. It was ordered that the wigwams be set ablaze, causing several Narragansett people, including women and children, to be driven out by the flames and shot dead by Puritan muskets. The battle could have been lost for New England had the Narragansett not run out of gunpowder, sparking a dramatic shift in the course of the battle. After this, it was inevitable that the colonials would overcome the native attempts to repulse them. As dusk arrived, after an argument amongst the English colonists, with some calling to camp outside the structure and wait for daybreak, it was determined that they would set fire to the fortification. The densely populated fortification went up in a roaring symphony of flames, illuminating the evening sky as the scorching fire consumed the lives of many of the women, children, and elderly who inhabited the fortress. The vast majority of the tribe's winter supplies were also destroyed in the attack. Many of the Narragansett warriors had given up their positions and fled from the scene when the battle appeared lost, trekking through the woods long before the fire had been set. After the destruction of the fort, the surviving Narragansett people were also in the woods surrounding the icy swamp, and the English sought to make an escape into the cold and dark landscape before an attack could be delivered upon them by the reorganizing warriors. Hundreds of the Narragansett wounded, warrior and civilian alike, died in the piercing conditions in the woods surrounding the swamp. The sachem, who was within the Narragansett tribe, returned the following day and buried all of the dead. First-hand accounts of the number of Narragansett women and children killed range from 100 to 150, while some historical accounts deduce it would have reached into the several hundreds when all was said and done. The English took as many of their dead as they could carry back to Wickford. The men they couldn't carry were left on the ground, and the sachem of the Narragansett would do the work of burying them as well. The colonists would lose many of their officers during the siege, with roughly 70 men killed in total, and another 150 wounded. Unsurprisingly, the Massachusetts regiment took the brunt of the casualties. The dead and wounded would be evacuated from Wickford to Aquidneck Island, a settlement in Narragansett Bay, where they would be looked after by Rhode Island colonists. The exact location of the Great Swamp Fortress remains disputed amongst archaeologists and historians to this day, with just a simple obelisk statue now acknowledging what transpired. Many have spoken of an unnerving, supernatural presence that can be felt on visits to the desolate location where hundreds were slain and buried throughout the swamp. For many years after the events, bones were visibly protruding through the soft, misshapen earth, painting a macabre landscape to serve as a grisly reminder of the events that took place there 3.5 centuries ago, and nearly brought a people to an end. The following spring, a vicious counteroffensive orchestrated by Comanches would be launched, with over 2,000 natives from a multitude of tribal denominations. It would engulf the Rhode Island capital of Providence in flames and escalate the diabolical conflict even further. But for tonight, that, along with the other many unnerving tales of King Philip's War, are other stories for other times. Apalachicola River in southwest Georgia, November 30th, 1817. A U.S. Army boat transporting supplies, along with 26 soldiers, 7 soldiers' wives, and their children, chart a path across the stream in modern-day Decatur County, Georgia, under the command of Lieutenant Scott. The air is brisk, but as the party approaches the confluence of the Apalachicola and Flint rivers, an eerie and unsettling sight befalls their eyes. Dozens of native warriors begin to appear standing and glaring upon them from the riverbanks. Yet most of the passengers upon this U.S. Army vessel can scarcely imagine the unmitigated horror that will soon be unleashed upon them, the massacre that will follow, and the haunting recollections of it that will unnerve the American population and set forth events that will reshape the geopolitical landscape of the American South for centuries to come. Tensions between the native populations of the South and the empires who laid claim upon their territories, be it France, Spain, Britain, or the newly birthed United States, had been in an ongoing struggle for many years, with various alliances with and against one another. From the recent Patriot War of East Florida that saw President Madison's desire to expand American territorial holdings in Florida from Spain, to the Creek War that saw soon-to-be President Andrew Jackson engaged in fierce combat with the Red Stick people over territories in the Deep South, to involvement by natives in the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. A bloody tapestry was weaved through the recent history of the land. As periods of factional peace bled into smaller and larger conflicts, it seemed as though the fighting would never cease. The Scott Massacre marked a significant elevation in the hostilities that had been going on between the United States and the Lower Creek peoples, as well as the Creek's offshoot, the Seminole Nation. U.S. forces had sought the arrest of Seminole leader Neamathla, and, after repeated attempts in getting him to present himself were denied, an American expedition to his village of Foultown was led by Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Arbuckle of the 7th U.S. Infantry Regiment. Neamathla is a name of Creek origin, meaning fat warrior, though the title also meant large and exceedingly brave, and the Creek leader would demonstrate the accuracy of this description throughout the rest of his life. The incursion into Foultown had taken part in 2 exchanges, first in a brief firefight that had resulted in a few casualties for the natives, including a woman, after which Neamathla retreated his people to the confines of a swamp, a tactic that would be used repeatedly by the natives throughout the entirety of the Seminole Wars. While the skirmish had certainly elevated tensions between the 2 parties, the return of American forces on the 23rd of November would turn the dispute into a bitter conflict of survival for Neamathla and his people. As the Americans returned to Foultown to find it abandoned, they discovered the natives' stockpile of corn and began to load it out in wagons. The corn reserves were absolutely critical to their survival of the upcoming winter, and upon learning of this action, Neamathla launched an assault on the Americans that resulted in several of the native warriors being shot down. They felt even though the odds of success in battle were grave, they would be condemned to a bleak and starved existence in the coming months if they did not take swift and decisive action. Whatever hopes there had been for peace between the Americans and the Creek and Red Stick peoples were now dashed. The incidents at Foultown had enraged thousands of southern natives. Large parties of warriors began moving to reinforce Neamathla and to block off the Apalachicola River to prevent the movement of supplies to Fort Scott. Revenge weighed heavily on their minds, and it would soon manifest itself in an abhorrent and grisly form. Major Peter Muhlenberg held command over supply ships making their way upriver on the Apalachicola. The major was unsettled that General Gaines had failed to deliver him significant help in his endeavor. When Lieutenant Scott reached his flotilla, he had but his single vessel, and only 40 men under his command upon it. Muhlenberg was unaware of the events of Foultown. He would replace half of Lieutenant Scott's able-bodied men with sick, unarmed soldiers, 7 soldiers' wives, and 4 children. Then load the vessel with as much regimental clothing as he could, and send them on towards Fort Scott. Lieutenant Scott carried with him a message to be delivered upon his arrival to the fort, requesting additional support be sent down to Muhlenberg, but it was a message that Scott would never be able to convey. The lieutenant did not encounter any difficulties upon the first leg of his journey. However, Scott was unnerved by the increased presence of warriors along the riverside. They were still unaware of the events of Foultown, but would soon learn of it upon their arrival to the Spanish Bluff, where a couple of traders had built their homes. The men had lived among the natives for years, dating back long before the War of 1812. Scott was shocked to hear of the hostilities at Foultown, and the traders gave him a dire warning that hundreds of Seminole, Maroon, and Red Stick warriors were now descending upon the Apalachicola in support of Neamathla. The traders implored Lieutenant Scott to hold off on the remainder of his mission until reinforcements could be sent from the fort to protect them. Attacks upon boats on the river by the Seminole and Red Sticks were inevitable. Scott wrote to General Gaines and informed him of the gentleman's advisement by name. Quote, Mr. Hamley informs me that the Indians are assembling at the junction of the rivers, where they intend to make a stand against those vessels coming up the river. Should this be the case, I am not able to make a stand against them. My command does not exceed 40 men, one half of which is sick and without arms. I leave this immediately. There can be no doubt, after reading that letter, that Lieutenant Scott was fully aware of the dire circumstances he now found himself within. Yet, he was unwilling to delay his voyage another moment in spite of these startling revelations. It would take the courier 2 full days to deliver the message to General Gaines. Perhaps Scott had expected the correspondence to arrive much sooner, and for relief to arrive before he reached the dangerous confluence of rivers where an attack was most likely to take place. But whatever the reasoning, Scott had just made a confounding miscalculation that would bear from it dreadful consequences. Lieutenant Scott continued up the Apalachicola River from Spanish Bluff, fully aware of the threats he faced. General Gaines would question the move by Scott in the aftermath of what was soon to follow. Quote, It appears, however, by a letter from Lieutenant Scott, received about the hour in which he was attacked, that he had been warned of the danger which awaited him. I must therefore conclude that he felt it his duty to proceed. Whether he had received from Major Muhlenberg a positive order to this effect, I have not learned. After leaving the home of the traders upon Spanish Bluff, the depleted men of Scott's vessel rowed hard against the high waters of the river. While very little is known of the construction of the ship, aside from its long oars, its size enough to hold 50 individuals, along with a decent supply of cargo, and that it was uncovered. The primary defenses of the boat, and the only ones of consequence, were the 20 muskets carried by the able-bodied soldiers aboard. Tensions rose within the watercraft as the boat made its slow and perilous journey. Survivors of the attack would recount to General Gaines that they had seen hundreds of warriors along the banks of the river after their departure from Spanish Bluff. Estimates ranged north of 500 native warriors having been spotted. On the morning of November 30th, 1817, the vessel approached the confluence of the Flint and Chattahoochee River, and the bloodiest day of the First Seminole War had now commenced. Only a handful of survivors would live to recount the gruesome events to follow. The chilly late November air caused a shiver amongst many aboard Lieutenant Scott's vessel, nearly half of which struggled with fits of brutal fever that had gripped several of the soldiers. While they suffered physically, the pressing concern was the appearance of the dozens of Creek, Seminole, Yuchi, and African Maroon warriors. Scott's boat came around a bend in the river, revealing they were just 2 miles ahead of the confluence of the rivers. The river was in the early stages of its winter rise, making the current even stronger. As they neared the widest part of the bend, the fast-moving waters pushed the boat from the center of the river near the east bank. The men aboard rowed fiercely against it, but the current ran hard into the side of the boat, pushing it even closer to the perimeter. Hundreds of warriors waited in the thick of the bushes and trees just beyond the riverbank, their faces streaked with war paint, rifles at the ready. They came from all over, and some were even residents of Foultown. Some spoke English, Spanish, French, or Muskogee. The high command of this broad contingent was Homathlamiko, a Red Stick chief from Alabama. Though he is recognized as the commander, the men would function as uniquely assembled war parties, all acting independently of one another, but to the end cause of the same vicious outcome. They combined to outnumber the men of Scott's craft more than 25 to 1. Scott and his men were preoccupied with getting their boat through the bend and back into the strait of the river when the first shots were fired upon them. Recalled by one of the survivors, quote, "The Indians had formed along the riverbank, and were not discovered until the fire commenced, in the first volley of which Lieutenant Scott and his most valuable men fell." The opening volley had managed to cut down Scott and the majority of his men who could mount any significant defense of the vessel. They fell before even so much as firing a single shot that day. The confederation of warriors that lined the east bank gave out an eclectic mash of spirited cries. Their sounds of gunfire and hollering drowned out the fearful bellows of the women and children, and the agonizing groans of the American wounded on board their doomed mission. A soldier known only by his last name, Gray, had been badly wounded in the opening salvo of the native coalition. He would be one of the few survivors, and recount that fateful morning around a campfire at Fort Scott. The account was recorded and told to Major Thomas Woodward. Quote, "As those on board were hooking and jamming near the bank and opposite a thick canebrake, the Indians fired upon them, killing and wounding most of those on board at the first fire. Those not disabled from the first fire of the Indians made the best fight they could, but all on board were killed except Mrs. Stewart and 2 soldiers, myself and another man whose name I have forgotten, if I ever knew it. They were both shot, but made their escape by swimming to the opposite shore. 6 or 7 soldiers had actually survived the attack. The Mrs. Stewart referred to in Gray's account was Elizabeth Stewart, the wife of a 1st Brigade soldier. Her husband was not on board. Of the 11 civilians present, only Elizabeth would survive, with 1 being abducted." Gray recounted that after the first volley, the boat ran aground in the shallows of the east side of the river, and that many warriors converged upon the vessel. The only significant resistance in the entire disastrous event by the Americans came from Sergeant Frederick McIntosh of the 7th Infantry, who made a valiant last stand. Quote, "When he found all on the boat were lost, and nothing more could be done, he went into a little kind of cabin that the lieutenant had occupied as his quarters, in which was a swivel or small cannon. He loaded it, took it on the deck, and resting the swivel on one arm ranged it as well as he could, and with a firebrand he set off the swivel, which cleared the boat for a few minutes of Indians. At the firing of the swivel he was thrown overboard and drowned." This defiant last act in the face of assured defeat allowed badly wounded Gray the opportunity to swim to the west shore of the river and escape the massacre. Scott was found still alive but wounded by the natives. He was killed by having hunks of fatwood hammered into his body and then set afire. It was, quote, "an excruciating form of execution that had its roots deep in the ancient traditions of the Creek Indians." The shocking events of the Scott Massacre had stoked the fire of the Americans even higher than their contemporaries after the incursion at Foultown, and now, with both sides inflamed and at one another's throats, the stage would be set for a dramatic conclusion to the First Seminole War. Gray would recuperate from his injuries at Fort Scott through the winter, and he was still taking his quarters there when the man who would bring this conflict to a violent conclusion arrived in March of 1818, Major General Andrew Jackson. But the end to this abrupt and brutal saga is, for tonight, another story for another time. Northern Wyoming, December 21st, 1866. As battle cries and screams of agony ring out all around him, 32-year-old Adolf Metzger is in a desperate fight for his life. Tucked back into the scarcely discernible shelter of a crevice amidst a field of boulders, the young German-born immigrant fights ferociously, swinging his weapon with all of his might as guttural exhortations fly unconsciously from his lips. His attackers, who have all but laid waste to his comrades, are a collection of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, hundreds strong, fighting under the command of the legendary Red Cloud. They wield bows, arrows, lances, knives, and tomahawks, and advance upon their ensconced quarry with the myopic fury of a hungry pride of lions. Metzger, for his part, wields only a small brass instrument, a bugle, that he desperately swings as dozens of lances and arrows berate his position. To a random passer-by, this spectacle would doubtless appear curious, if not slightly comical, were it not for the deadly serious consequences of the fight at hand. But, as curious as the sight might be, it is anything but a random encounter. Adolf Metzger is a soldier in the United States Army, serving in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, C Company. At 5 feet 8 inches tall, with brown hair and blue eyes, he cuts a similar figure to many of his comrades who now lie cold in death around his position. He serves as the company bugler, a critical position in a time before radio communication. Metzger's job is to belt out the appropriate tunes on the bugle to denote attacks, retreats, and various maneuvers. The U.S. Army has determined that buglers need both hands free in order to properly execute their duties, and thus, the only weapon that Metzger has left is the diminutive brass instrument, with which he now makes a desperate last stand. Though he now stands here incurring the consequences of the United States government's repeated offenses against the Northern Plains nations, Metzger is but a poor soldier, at the mercy of his commanders and his duty. 6 months earlier, in June of 1866, the 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, had ridden out of Fort Laramie in what is today southeastern Wyoming and into what is known as the Powder River Country with orders to protect immigrants traveling on the Bozeman Trail. A treaty had been agreed to with most of the powerful Northern Plains nations in 1851, including the Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapaho, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Crow tribes. Signed in the very fort Carrington had ridden out of, it is known as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The treaty had designated this area in the Powder River Country as belonging to the Crow tribe, and guaranteed it immunity from incursion by either rival tribes or American settlers. However, a decade and a half of dwindling buffalo herds and increasing encroachment from westbound immigrants has driven the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho into more and more desperate straits. Fed up with the lack of trustworthiness exhibited by the United States government, the mighty Red Cloud has gathered a formidable army of highly motivated warriors intent not only on forestalling westward expansion, but on eliminating every soldier, settler, and rival tribe from their territory for good. While many of the soldiers now serving in the post-Civil War Army are indeed accustomed to combat and the hardships of life on the trail, none of them, nor their superiors, have seen anything like the warfare being waged upon them by Red Cloud. For the next few months, after their arrival in the Powder River Country, as they labored and constructed the fort that would be their home, the soldiers dealt with incessant attacks from warriors riding under the command of Red Cloud. Even after the fort was completed, Colonel Carrington was reticent to send any patrols outside of its walls in order to engage and deter the constant onslaught of piecemeal attacks. As the casualties mounted and the frustration amongst the ranks grew, Carrington's subordinate officers, most notably Captain William Fetterman, began to insist more and more vociferously that the only way to stop the attacks was to take the fight to Red Cloud and his warriors. Carrington and Fetterman had both served in the Union Army during the Civil War, though both men had had wildly different experiences throughout the conflict. While both had served honorably, Carrington, a Yale-educated officer and highly regarded as a masterful bureaucrat, had not seen combat on the front lines. Instead, he had solidified his reputation as a tireless organizer and, by war's end, had become head of a Union spy ring being run out of Indianapolis. Carrington, as well as his superiors, saw this excursion into the Powder River Country as an opportunity to garner the 42-year-old a measure of actual combat experience and pad his otherwise exemplary record. Whether due to his disposition, inexperience, or simply differing discernment of the situation at hand, Carrington had repeatedly denied his officers permission to pursue the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. By December of 1866, this had caused an increasing level of discontent amongst nearly everyone ensconced within the timber confines of the fort. While no major engagements had taken place, it seemed to the inhabitants of the fort that one or two of them were turning up dead with alarming regularity. Among the most vocal proponents of taking up a more offensive course of action against the native attackers is Captain Fetterman. In stark contrast to his superior officer, Captain Fetterman has seen frontline action in the Civil War. He had participated in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, as well as Sherman's March. After the conclusion of the Civil War, Fetterman had stayed in the U.S. Army with the intentions of becoming a career officer. Though Fetterman's father had served as an officer in the Army, he had been orphaned as a young man and in his late teens denied entrance into West Point. Though he had gone on to assemble an impressive military resume, the combined lack of both a familial and educational pedigree imbued the captain with a burning sense of ambition. Though it was not an uncommon exhortation amongst American officers on the plains, Fetterman had repeatedly claimed that with a force of 80 men, he could wipe out the entire Sioux nation. Finally, after being ordered by General George Cooke to take the offensive against the murderous and insulting attacks, Carrington began to take a more aggressive approach against Red Cloud and his warriors. On December 6th, Carrington received word that a wagon train of woodcutters was under attack. The woodcutters, men whose job of venturing out into the nearby woods to procure timber was quickly becoming one of the most dangerous professions on the frontier, were roughly 4 miles west of the relative safety of the fort walls. Immediately grasping the gravity of the situation, Carrington ordered Fetterman to lead a company of cavalry and a squad of mounted infantry directly to the scene, while he led another attachment north to cut off the retreat of the warriors. Carrington had, in fact, made tactically astute decisions. However, 2 young lieutenants named Drummond and Bingham had led 3 other troops in pursuit of a small group of warriors, only to wind up in an ambush. Drummond and 2 others had managed to escape, narrowly making it back to rejoin their commander with several of Red Cloud's warriors in hot pursuit. Carrington had then found himself and the remainder of his contingent surrounded by roughly 100 warriors. However, with the arrival of Fetterman and his backup, the attacking warriors were compelled to retreat north, disappearing over the rolling hills. As Carrington and his men re-entered the walls of Fort Kearny, it was all too obvious to those of them that had seen combat in the Civil War that this, combat on the open plains, would be an altogether different business. Those who had never experienced combat before this were chilled to the bone by the realization that they were all a very long way from home, with limited support, surrounded by their enemy in their enemy's own land. It must have seemed to many that their saving grace would indeed be their faction's superior technology. While U.S. Army soldiers who had fought the Plains tribes prior to the Civil War had been largely armed with single-shot rifles and early iterations of the Colt revolver, these men were equipped with weapons developed largely over the course of the preceding 6 years. The officers among them generally carried the Model 1860 Colt or 1858 Remington 44 caliber revolvers. The typical infantryman carried the Springfield Model 1863 rifle musket chambered in .58 caliber, while the typical cavalryman was armed with either a Spencer Model 1860 52 caliber or Model 1865 50 caliber 7-shot repeating carbine. The warriors fighting under Red Cloud are largely armed with only their traditional bows, lances, shields, and war clubs, with only a few warriors armed with 44 caliber revolvers and single-shot flintlock rifles. This discrepancy in firepower is, it is now obvious to most, the only thing keeping them alive here in the unforgiving austerity of the snow-laden Powder River country. In their after-action reports, Carrington and Fetterman concurred that the lack of discipline and organization exhibited by the troops during the engagement was indeed cause for great concern. Fetterman commented that this Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight, requiring the utmost caution. The one man in the fort with significant experience in fighting the tribes of the northern plains was the 62-year-old legendary mountain man, trapper, scout, explorer, and frontiersman Jim Bridger, who served as a lead scout for Carrington. Bridger, who for weeks had observed the increasing difficulties of the young soldiers in dealing with the attacks from the native warriors, remarked to the general that, "Your soldiers don't know anything about fighting Indians." Carrington had immediately redoubled the training of his troops, drilling them incessantly and making abundantly clear to the officers, time and again, that caution must be exercised in all engagements, attacks must be limited, and all maneuvers made in the interest of minimizing their men's exposure to danger. The number of guards on duty was doubled, and all of the 50 remaining horses of the fort were to remain saddled from dawn to dark in case of an immediate need. On December 19th, the drilling and precautions seemed to have paid off when General Carrington had ordered a captain named Powell to assist a group of woodcutters under attack. Following his orders with scrupulous detail, Powell had indeed managed to force the attacking warriors into retreat. He had not allowed any pursuit of the warriors and had returned safely with the woodcutting detail in tow. The following day, Carrington had refused the request of Captain Fetterman and Captain Brown, another veteran officer, to take a contingent of well-armed civilian employees of the fort on a raid to disperse or capture a Lakota village situated roughly 50 miles away on the Tongue River. This almost certainly saved the lives of all the proposed participants, as the village was much larger and much more ready to make war than the captains realized. However, the cavalrymen's respite from the cold of death would be tragically all too brief. It would be only a day later, on December 21st at about 10 a.m., when General Carrington was alerted of a band of warriors yet again harassing a party of woodcutters. The morning had been clear and cold, and while another attack had been expected, most had hoped their advancing from the fort might come in the comparatively warmer hours of the afternoon. By all accounts of those present, Carrington gave Captain Fetterman clear orders not to pursue the warriors over Lodge Trail Ridge that lay to the north of the fort. He was only to proceed northwest, reinforce the security detail accompanying the woodcutting party, and return. Under no circumstances, Carrington ordered, are you to pursue over the ridge to the north. Captain Fetterman departed the fort not long after 10 a.m. Captain Brown, soon to receive orders to leave the fort and loath to pass up one last opportunity at avenging his fallen countrymen, volunteered to go as well. Issuing the call to advance outside the gates had been Adolph Metzger, whose steady intonations hid a growing unease rapidly taking hold of his nerves. Marching forward under the directives of Metzger's bugle is the largest relief force yet sent out by Carrington, including a detachment of infantrymen on foot. Leading a small detachment of cavalry assigned to support these men on their way to the battlefield is Lieutenant George Drummond, who only days earlier had narrowly escaped death by impetuously pursuing a party of warriors into the ambush that had killed Lieutenant Bingham and another soldier. As the gates to the fort closed, Carrington retreated to his quarters, by all accounts relatively confident in Fetterman's fidelity to his orders, but concerned about the discipline of Lieutenant Bingham, considering his actions on the previous few days. However, with limited men and limited time, he still felt that Bingham was more of an asset than a liability. However, within the hour, before 11 a.m., Carrington would be alerted that Fetterman had, despite his explicit orders, pursued the party of attacking warriors to the north. Within the confines of the fort, the situation is maddeningly inexplicable to the general. Later accounts of the battle from Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho sources shed light on what might have provoked an attack that should have been explicitly prohibited under direct order. Among the warriors attacking the wagon train on this icy northern plains morning is a young warrior with oddly light skin and wavy hair. He had been spotted before by the soldiers and woodcutters alike, standing out not only for his appearance, but his unyielding ferocity. Again and again, when other warriors had retreated, or worse yet, fallen in death, the young man had proven indefatigable in assaulting his enemy. His own people, too, were increasingly impressed with his bravery and selflessness. Though still in his early 20s, the young man was beginning to cultivate a reputation as a fearless warrior and trustworthy leader. As a child, because of his hair, he had been known as Curly. Now, he is known amongst his people as Tisonka Whitco, or Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse and company, upon seeing the arrival of Captain Fetterman and his men, see yet another opportunity to employ one of their favorite tactics, a feigned retreat. In hopes of drawing the army officer's ire and enticing him to follow their feigned retreat into an ambush, Crazy Horse hurls repeated insults at Fetterman and his men, cursing them in English and striking threatening poses as a challenge. Finally, in either desperation or disgust, Crazy Horse had turned his back to the soldiers, dropped his leather leggings, and mooned them. Whether or not this insult is indeed the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, Fetterman's men did indeed give chase. One possibility later proffered by researchers is that it was in fact Grumman, again at the mercy of his own vainglorious impulses, who broke ranks and began to lead the charge. As the pursuit carried on northward, Grumman and the bulk of the force pulled ahead of Fetterman, Brown, and the remainder of the force by several hundred yards. As they proceeded over the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, however, they are met with what must have been a sickeningly bone-chilling sight. Thousands of warriors stood ready to meet them. The attack was not sprung until Grumman and his party were near the bottom of the ridge, with Fetterman and Brown between them and the fort. At first, an attempt to stand their ground is made. Then, Quickly seeing the futility of this approach, Drummond, leading the contingent of troops furthest down the hill, begins to lead a fighting retreat up the steep slope, intending to reunite with Fetterman. Now, as the battle rages on, the attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho have managed to separate the two forces further. Though he fights valiantly and attempts to lead the men who have followed him back up the hill, Drummond is soon cut down in vicious hand-to-hand combat. As the infantry desperately slip and slide as they attempt to climb their way up the hill, they too are cut down in brutal fashion by arrows, clubs, and spears. Soon, the white snow of the hillside is stained in large swatches of blood and viscera. Fetterman and Brown lead the men still alive under their command to an outcropping of boulders, from where they presumably intend to hold out until reinforcements arrive. They squeeze off round after round, desperately trying to issue orders over the din of rifle fire, war cries, and the screams of the wounded and dying. It is mere minutes, however, before Captain Fetterman is cut down by a hulking Sioux warrior named American Horse, with a devastating blow from his nail-studded war club, after which the warrior leaps from his horse and cuts the American's throat. The outcropping is overrun in short order, with troopers falling all around in their final throes of agony as they are brutalized by attacking warriors. Knowing the fate that now awaits him, Captain Brown fires off every remaining round in his revolver, saving the last for himself. Before he can be overtaken and subjected to the torturous demise of his comrades, Captain Brown falls dead by his own hand. Among the last left alive is Adolph Metzger, who now knows he has but moments left to live. As the hellish reality unfolds around him, perhaps his mind indeed recalls a brief synopsis of his life. Scenes he will never see again. The German countryside of his youth, the countless charges he had survived during the previous few years, and doubtless recollections of his worried mother and beloved, long-suffering wife, Frederica, whom he had married while still on campaign in the summer of 1864. This respite, though, must last only moments. As Metzger continues to swing his instrument, the bugle incurring dents as his body incurs slashes and stab wounds. He backs further into the crevice, now with no room left to retreat. The scene over the next few minutes is one of unabated brutality, as Metzger too is slashed, cut, and bludgeoned until he finally falls dead on the cold Wyoming ground. The last American soldier left alive during this engagement, one that will come to be known as the Fetterman Massacre, or Fetterman's Fight, is now gone. To the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, the success of their tactics is inarguable. Before this battle, a Sioux medicine man had reported having a dream, in which he had held 100 dead blue-coat soldiers in each hand. In the lore of the Sioux, the battle is known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. This engagement would be the most costly ever inflicted upon the U.S. Army until a full decade later, when many of the same warriors would decimate Custer's forces at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. For Red Cloud, the utter devastation wrought upon the U.S. Army in this engagement is but a pretense of things to come. The Battle of the 100 in the Hand is but one engagement in what will come to be known as Red Cloud's War, the most successful military campaign ever led by native forces against the United States Army. But the epic tale of how the mighty Sioux chief managed to bring to bear the power of his leadership and his people's resolve in one of the greatest military campaigns in the history of the Old West, as well as the story of how General Carrington responded to the tragic massacre of his men, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. July 3rd, 1754. George Washington signs off on the surrender of Fort Necessity after a relentless assault by a contingent of French and native forces. The official tally for the British would be 31 killed, 70 wounded, and 369 captured, including Colonel George Washington himself. The Franco-Indian force only lost 3 men, with 19 wounded. The numbers do little to paint the true picture of despair the colonial militiamen found themselves in that day, with their killed and wounded littering the drenched sod of the Great Meadows, after a torrential downpour that afternoon rendered even their weapons impotent. Perhaps even Washington himself would have found it hard to believe that in just 1 year's time he would be back in the Ohio country just 50 miles north, facing levels of atrocities that would outshine the defeat at Fort Necessity tenfold. On July 4th, Washington headed out from Fort Necessity with his men, having agreed to not return for a period of 1 year under the conditions of his surrender and release. 2 colonial officers were to be held captive by the French for this period to ensure the terms were observed. Washington prioritized getting the wounded to medical care as quickly as possible, hoping to save as many men as they could, with many requiring amputations from the onset of infections in their wounds. Along the way, the natives continued to loot and raid the militiamen, but Washington ordered them to stand down, not wanting to suffer another violent confrontation that would almost certainly end in the other side's favor. During the Battle of Fort Necessity, the Congress of Albany was underway, taking place from mid-June through mid-July 1754. The Congress saw representatives of 7 British colonies convene to discuss how to improve relations with native tribes and defend themselves against the encroachment of New France in their territorial interests. At the Congress, Benjamin Franklin attempted to get the colonies to agree to a plan of union, forming together under a president appointed by the British Crown. The popular Join or Die political cartoon was born from Franklin's idea. While this plan was voted down by the representatives, it would become the basis of the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution adopted 2 decades later, the foundation of the independent United States government. After the disappointing defeat at Fort Necessity, Washington resigned his post when the Virginia Regiment was divided into 10 independent companies. This realignment would have brought with it a demotion from the rank of colonel. Washington knew the early retirement would be temporary, writing that his stepping aside was, quote, "not to gratify any desire I had to leave the military. My inclinations are strongly bent to arms." After the death of his father, Lawrence Washington, a series of events would lead to his coming into power as the Lord of Mount Vernon. Lawrence's widow Anne remarried and moved to Westmoreland County, and then on December 10, 1754, her daughter Sarah passed away. George, who was not a wealthy man by his own means whatsoever at the time, would lease the estate from Anne, as well as its 18 slaves, under the condition that each Christmas, George would ship 15,000 pounds of tobacco to Anne as payment. This agreement would bring George Washington considerable stress, but would also, in time, make him one of the wealthiest men in the Virginia Commonwealth. Major General Edward Braddock was sent to the British colonies to lead an aggressive, multi-pronged campaign to rebuke New France from their territory. Braddock arrived in Hampton, Virginia, on February 20, 1755, with 2 regiments of British regular troops. His comprehensive strategy included Admiral Edward Boscawen sailing a fleet to the Gulf of St. Lawrence to prevent French reinforcements from reaching Canada. Braddock's 2 regiments were sent to Wills Creek to embark on an expedition to Fort Duquesne. The 50th and 51st Regiments had been dormant since King George's War and were to head out from Albany to the French fort of Niagara under the command of William Shirley. After Braddock took Fort Duquesne, he would continue up the Allegheny River, one by one taking every French fort along the way until uniting with Shirley in Niagara that fall. Major General Braddock requested that George Washington join his staff. While he had reservations about the young colonel's conduct at Fort Necessity, Braddock learned that Washington possessed an intimate knowledge of the landscape of the Ohio country that would prove invaluable. Washington responded that he wished to be given a royal officer's commission, elevating him above the status he held as colonel in the Virginia militia. When that was denied, Washington offered to serve as aide-de-camp in a volunteer capacity. This position would prevent him from being ordered around by the British officers and have him directly reporting to Braddock. In hindsight, had Washington been given the royal officer commission he so vigorously sought, there is a distinct possibility he would not have altered that allegiance to become the commander-in-chief in 1775 of the United States Army. Washington wrote that an ambitious man must hide his desires, and though he desired not only the royal officer's status, but also to run for the House of Burgess, ultimately he inquired to his younger brother Jack to gather information on how it would be received were George to run. Finding his support was not at the time sufficient, he opted not to run, thus showing his penchant for political cunning and a willingness to undertake clandestine action when it benefited him. After appointing Jack Washington to take over as Lord of Mount Vernon in his absence, George would join Braddock in May of 1755 in Frederick, Maryland. Colonel Washington disputed Major General Braddock's plan for an assault through traditional means, informing him of the fighting style of the natives. Their desire was to inflict damage on a larger force and flee before suffering casualties, stressing an asymmetrical approach to warfare. Braddock maintained an air of superiority towards every colonial he interacted with, even at his own peril. Upon these forewarnings of the natives' penchant for hostile ambush, he demurred. "These savages may be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, it is impossible that they would make any impression." In early June, Braddock and his force of 3,000 men headed out for the forks of the Ohio. With dozens of cattle in tow, as well as 50 women who had agreed to assist the procession, the pace of their advance was at times 2 miles a day. Braddock had rebuked Washington's suggestion to travel lightly through the Appalachian range they were to traverse. Taking only pack horses and bare essentials, Braddock, however, opted for an overloaded caravan of carriages and cannons. Braddock, who was unfamiliar with the physical geography, also struggled to make headway, as much of the trails and roads they needed to use had to be widened and worked on as they advanced. Washington would call for them to split into 2 columns, one with the majority of the fighting men to charge ahead, and the other column to construct the pathway, bringing it up with the women, cattle, and wagons. Braddock would agree on the adoption of this strategy and lead the column charge forth at a great pace, the general so emboldened by the lack of resistance they faced along the way that he would end up several miles ahead of the supply column. Washington was afflicted with dysentery that gave him fits of diarrhea and vomiting that severely depleted his energy. He also suffered from an agonizing case of hemorrhoids that caused him to have to travel lying flat in the back of a wagon much of the time, unable to sit upon a saddle. Braddock gave Washington a bottle of Dr. James's medical powder, a combination of phosphate of lime and antimony, to treat his hemorrhoids. Washington would call it the finest medicine in the world. Just after crossing the Monongahela en route to Fort Duquesne, the progress would come to an abrupt halt. On the morning of July 9th, a majority native coalition force led by French Captain Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu arrived too late to the river to ambush the British and colonial forces. The French captain's forces number roughly 800 men under his command, about half the number of men stationed to defend Fort Duquesne, composed of officers, regulars, as well as Canadian militia, alongside 600 native warriors. Among the tribes present are the Ottawa, the Mississauga, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Wyandot, and the Potawatomi. The native forces hid amongst the trees on either side of the road towards Fort Duquesne, with the majority of the French Canadians stationed further up the road along the path to the fort. Around 1 o'clock that afternoon, the advance guard of the British, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, spotted the enemy lying in wait in the trees just after crossing the river, and ordered his men to fire upon them. The opening volley of the battle did little damage to the Franco-native forces as a whole, but as luck would have it, Captain Beaujeu was caught in the line of fire and killed in the opening salvo of the Battle of Monongahela, which would also be referred to, for good reason, as the Battle of the Wilderness. The native forces, as they had done at Fort Necessity, took cover amongst the trees, stones, and brush, raining down an ongoing fire upon the redcoats. The British repeatedly attempted to form themselves into columns, as was their training, and in doing so merely simplified the task of the natives. As the advance guard was repelled, suffering heavy casualties, Gage's men began to retreat. While this was occurring, Braddock ordered the troops from the main body to charge forward, causing a chaotic sequence when they collided with one another in a folly of errors. This allowed the natives to wreak further havoc as they fired on this tangled mass of humanity, disorganized, disheveled, and suffering ever greater losses. As officers of the advance guard attempt to organize their men, waving swords that glittered in the sun overhead, they became the easiest targets of all. Gage's force suffered 18 officers killed in these early exchanges. This perpetuated a further breakdown of British command and discipline. Braddock attempted to reclaim order by calling for his men to reorganize and advance, but the mounting losses and unrelenting native fire prevented any ensemble larger than a platoon from forming. The disoriented herd of British soldiers were corralled together in an area stretching less than 250 yards in length and under 100 feet across. Even when the British soldiers could gather themselves enough to return fire, they had few targets of which to take aim. Their best chances to fire came when a native was sprinting from one tree to another to reposition himself with even deadlier effectiveness, and even then they would only catch a mere glimpse of them. When the redcoats formed themselves into lines as they had been trained, multiple incidents of friendly fire occurred. The rear guard, tasked with defending the siege cannons brought to overcome Fort Duquesne, were left on their own. Civilian teamsters unhitched their horses from their wagons and rode away in fear. The women who had been driving the cattle, just over 50 in total, were nearly all lost, with over half being killed outright. Braddock maintained the most steadfast level of composure throughout this day, riding valiantly even as 4 horses had been shot out from underneath him. It was only when a musket ball was shot through Braddock's back, knocking him off his horse, that a complete collapse in order occurred. This came after withstanding ceaseless fire for over 3 hours. Washington, who had ridden up from the rear with Braddock, had by all accounts performed courageously, having had 2 horses shot out from under him that day, and even requiring the help of his men to place him back in the saddle as he was so stricken from exhaustion due to his illness. By the end of the day, Washington had 4 bullet holes torn through his cap and uniform, but as per usual, he was improbably unharmed. The final tally of British and colonial losses from their 1,300 strong was 457 killed, 450 wounded, and a few dozen taken prisoner. James Smith, a member of this colonial British force who was captured that day, would recall several soldiers being tortured and burned alive in the night following the battle. As they retreated from the battlefield, Washington received his final order from the dying Braddock to deliver a message to Colonel Dunbar, his division lying 40 miles to the rear, to send forth wagons, medicine, and provision for the helpless legions of defeated and dying that lay in the wake of the day's affair. Washington, exhausted and ill, gathered the fortitude to ride all through the night to deliver the message. During the retreat back from the Monongahela, Braddock succumbed to his wounds, and Washington had him buried on the road passing through the Great Meadows near Fort Necessity. After his burial, Washington had the wagons and men traverse over the top of his freshly dug grave, packing the earth back together tightly to prevent it from being discovered by natives and saving his body from desecration. Colonel Dunbar led the defeated force back to the east. He ordered 150 wagons to be burned and the cannons destroyed, preventing these supplies and armaments from falling into enemy hands. The dejected survivors then carried on towards Philadelphia. Captain Bugeaud was buried on July 12th at Fort Duquesne, the victor in a battle that saw both commanders lose their lives. The defeat was far more shocking to the British than Fort Necessity, as the small, undersized militia force inside the crudely built fortification had not been expected to stave off such an act of French aggression on their own. Braddock's multi-front strategy, designed to evoke the power of the British Empire and her colonies to drive out New France, was for all intents and purposes buried with Major General Braddock on the road passing Great Meadows. New France now had a strong foothold within the Ohio country. Braddock left his battle sash and 2 pistols to George Washington, and it was recorded that Braddock's last spoken words were, "Who would have thought? We shall know better another time." It would take 3 long years for the British to return to Fort Duquesne and attempt to turn the tide of war that was now undeniably underway. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. May 1823, in the territory of what is now South Dakota, on the vast expanse of the undulating prairie that extended to the horizon in every direction, a contingent of mules, horses, and men moved warily next to a river, with pensive eyes switching from the water to the surrounding landscape, searching for signs of danger. They were hundreds of miles from anything resembling a city, in a territory that did not belong to them. They were a mix of men from a plethora of backgrounds, dressed in wool shirts, buckskin leggings, boots, moccasins, serapes, raccoon-skin caps, flat-brimmed hats, and belts. Their common goal, put simply, was money. Money by way of accumulating and selling beaver pelts, the coveted material that made the popular top hats of the day worn throughout New York, Paris, and London. The means were simple. Set traps for the beavers, the animals would become ensnared in the traps and drown, they would collect the beaver pelts, and repeat this process until it became hard to find beaver. Then, they would move on. Simple. But simple does not always equal easy. Opposing them were the elements, from blazing heat to icy cold, from snow to dust storms, from droughts to flash flooding. Hostile native tribes like the Blackfoot, Arikara, and Comanche killed many in gruesome ways for violating their tribal territory bounds. Among this party of men were some who would go on to become legends in the annals of mountain man history. They were commanded by General William H. Ashley and Major Andrew Henry, and among their ranks were Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith, 2 men whose future exploits would become the stuff of mountain man legend. Smith was an anomaly amongst an already anomalous lot. as he was a devout Methodist, read the Bible daily, refrained from coarse language, as well as dalliances with unknown women and strong drink. On this day, he was approached by Major Henry and directed to ride south to General Ashley's fort, known aptly as Fort Ashley. He was to inform General Ashley that the company was in need of more horses and that the Arikara tribe would likely be the closest to trade with in horseflesh. Jedediah Smith was still a relative neophyte in the world of fur trapping, but was a man on the rise within the ranks of his company as his reputation as a stalwart and trustworthy hand was growing. So Smith set out south and was actually met by Ashley coming north at the Arikara village, where they sought to buy more horses. In terms of business, this appeared quite fortuitous for the trappers. The Arikara, a northern plains semi-agricultural tribe known for both their prowess in trade and warfare, whose ire had been stirred by some recent bad dealings with other white traders, were in a less than cordial mood. However, Ashley and his men had guns and ammunition that the Arikara knew they could acquire through few, if any, other sources. Thus, there was a terse and tense peace, as often happened in these instances. Tribes and trappers were not necessarily antagonistic, in fact, quite the opposite. Fur companies routinely employed native persons as translators, trackers, and trappers, as well as brokered many trading deals with tribes from New York to Oregon. Even in the early 19th century, in the middle of the plains, no culture existed in a vacuum. From the armchair of posterity, we are often inclined to view the cultural landscape at the time as a binary us versus them, or natives versus Americans paradigm. This was not only not true then, but it had not been the case for centuries. Tribes had warred and traded with each other for eons before the arrival of any European, and the introduction of the Spanish, French, English, Canadians, and Americans did not stop this, but only incorporated them into the complex and ever-evolving milieu of the New World. So, some initial dealings were made between the two parties, and it was mutually agreed upon that the trading would continue the next day. Ashley split his forces into one on land to guard the supplies, and two in the two boats which were anchored about 30 yards off the banks of the river. Ashley would be in direct command of the boats, and Jedediah Smith would be in charge of the force on land. Nearly all of the mountain men present went about their nightly routine of making dinner, cleaning their weapons, checking their supplies, and preparing for the next day's travel and trading. But when all had bedded down for the night, two men from the mountain men's party snuck into the Arikara camp with whiskey and trinkets that they hoped to trade for sexual favors from the Arikara women. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. But just as the braves made it to the shore and the sound of sloshing water from their swim strokes had abated, they were replaced by the frantic screams of the two mountain men who had snuck into the Arikara camp. These men had indeed found the Arikara women that they were hoping to, but they had also found Arikara men who were not too happy with the presence of intruders attempting to defile their wives, daughters, and sisters. One had been cut down in the camp, and another, Edward Rose, had escaped and now appeared on the banks of the river, making his way as fast as he could for Jedediah Smith's party. He screamed that his partner in mischief, a man named Aaron Stevens, was dead, and the Arikara were now in a collectively combative mood. Still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness and alerted to both the attempted robbery of Ashley's boat and the killing of their comrade in the camp by the now presumably enraged Arikara, the mountain men began to vociferously debate their options. Some argued for immediately moving the horses they had, a sizable herd by this point, to the opposite shore before daybreak, so that they might be in a better position to flee when the sun came up, with at least the river between them and the expected Arikara attack. Others argued for the retrieval of Stephen's body. As these debates carried on, a lone Arikara appeared on the horizon above the riverbanks. Still in the dark, he called out that he would try to broker a deal to get them Stephen's body back for the price of one of their best horses. The mountain men agreed to this, but a short time later, the enterprising Arikara returned to inform them that unfortunately he would not be able to uphold his end of the deal. Stevens's body had been so badly mutilated, he said, that there was nothing substantive for him to bring back to them. This, understandably, sent a cold chill through the ranks of the party. It was decided that they would now have to move the horses as soon as possible, as the sunrise neared with every passing minute. Remaining calm and cool by all accounts, Jed Smith embraced his first real opportunity at leadership and calmly directed the movement of the horses to and then across the river. However, as the sun began to rise, and a large number of horses and men were still mid-river or near the bank waiting for their turn to move, the mountain men were greeted with a horrifying sight. Silhouetted in the new morning sunlight were hundreds of Arikara warriors, tamping down shot into their muskets, knocking their arrows, and taking up offensive positions. The full gravity of the situation hit everyone present, seemingly instantly and seemingly simultaneously. They were stuck, with the enemy having the high ground and no cover to be found. At this point, fish in a barrel might not have been an adequate descriptor of the position of the men present in the shore party. Within moments, musket balls, spears, and arrows began to rain down on them from above. Dozens of horses and a few men fell dead in the initial volley, with many others gravely wounded. The screams of injured and dying horses and men filled the air, as Ashley and the men in the boats attempted to meet them on the other shore and make their getaway. The boats provided what covering fire they could, and the men on shore took cover behind the bodies of the dead horses. From here, as chaos reigned all around, Jed Smith coolly and calmly doled out directions to those in charge. As he and his men fired and reloaded, they made strategic retreats, making their way via leapfrogging one defensive position at a time to the comparative cover and safety of the boats. In all of this, Ashley's boat had run aground momentarily on a sandbar. The other boat, at around this time, cut the tie to their anchor and began moving downstream in an attempt to save at least themselves from this seemingly helpless situation. Ashley's boat was quickly freed and made its way as close to the shore as possible. Jed Smith and his men finally reached the banks of the river. They dove in and began to frantically swim. Some were hit by arrows and some by musket balls, and they sank under the surface, never to be seen again. Some were swept down the river, beyond the extended oars and hands of their comrades, also never to be seen again. The lucky few who managed to make it to the boats, including Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, hunkered down and returned fire as the boats made their way as fast as possible down the Missouri River and out of the Arikara musket and arrow range. For some of these men, this would be enough to end their mountain man adventures. Those who had decided that they had seen enough of this wild and dangerous life were put on a boat back to St. Louis along with their injured and recovering companions. No one could blame them, and no one did, for preferring the comforts of home to this lonely land where life was short and seemingly cheap. However, Colonel Ashley, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith were not done. Ashley would go on to mount retributive efforts with the U.S. Army, and Hugh Glass would go on to pen a heart-wrenching letter to the family of John Gardner, a mountain man who had been killed in the Arikara fight. The following is that letter. Dear Sir, my painful duty is to tell you of the death of your son who befell at the hands of the Indians 2nd June in the early morning. He lived little while after he was shot and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. We brought him to the ship where he soon died. Mr. Smith, a young man of our company, made a powerful prayer which moved all of us greatly, and I am persuaded that John died in peace. His body we buried with others near this camp and marked the grave with a log. His things we will send to you. The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after a great storm of rain and thunder, they came at us before light, and many were hurt. I myself was shot in the leg. Master Ashley is bound to stay in these parts till the traitors are rightly punished. Your obedient servant, Hugh Glass. This letter denotes not only Glass's deep sense of humanity, but it's the first mention of Jedediah Smith's piety and character from one of his contemporaries. Jedediah Smith would mount an expedition along with an unnamed French-Canadian trader to a nearby fort in hopes of mounting even larger retributive forces to supplement those that Ashley had already mustered. After this, he would carry on to travel perhaps more country than any other mountain man ever. The stories of the exploits of Ashley, Glass, and Jed Smith are too numerous to summarize in one episode, though rest assured we will be delving into their stories again soon. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. July 27, 1816. Along the Apalachicola River in the panhandle of Spanish Florida stands Negro Fort, a structure built just 2 years prior by the British to serve their cause during their failed reclamation of the United States colonies in the War of 1812. Within the confines of the fort stood a diverse contingent of Choctaw natives and fugitive slaves from Spanish and American colonies. They are locked in a defensive struggle to hold the sanctuary from an incursion by American Brigadier General Edmund Pendleton Gaines, his 116 Army soldiers, more than 150 Coweta and Creek allies, and a small command of U.S. gunboats. The fugitive slaves, many of whom fought alongside the British in the War of 1812, held out hope that the island empire would return to their relief. But the British, having been repulsed in the war, would have no further strategic interest in coming back. The colonial fugitives, led by a 30-year-old former slave, a skilled carpenter who fled from Spanish-held Pensacola, going only by the moniker Garçon, had informed the Americans and their native allies that they would accept nor offer any quarter, for they knew the intentions of the Americans to return them back to their quote-unquote legal owners into bondage. After weeks of preparation, skirmishing, and terse deliberations, the Battle of Negro Fort would come to a catastrophic and horrifying end, as several hundred lives of the men, women, and children within the timber walls of the fortification would at once come to a furious and fiery end, stamped out in an instant with a single emphatic explosion of powder and iron that would scarce be seen in this era of human combat. The demographic landscape of the territory now encompassing the current American state of Florida had undergone a series of drastic alterations in the 3 centuries preceding this battle. Beginning in the early 1500s, the Spanish Empire would undertake the first major European land claim within North America. They would establish a small number of forts and settlements at St. Mark's, St. Augustine, and, in the west, Pensacola, but would not establish considerable settlements beyond the trifecta of territorial anchors. The Florida mainland had once been a thriving, interwoven network of native peoples, but, along with the Spanish expeditionary missions, came a host of infectious diseases that devastated these indigenous populations, rendering much of La Florida sparsely populated for years to come. To the north of Florida, in territory that now largely belongs to the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, were the still thriving Creek people. The Creeks did not have a traditional hierarchical structure. Instead, they had an interwoven confederacy of clans, tracing their lineage all the way back to a single maternal ancestor. The various clans would, by principle, intermarry with one another, creating an enduring bond and tying them all together in what has been described as, quote, the rope of sand. Yet, the multi-generational tapestry these native clans had long enjoyed would face a civilizational crisis that came not from the European settlers' diseases, but rather their way of life. In the 1700s, what could broadly be described as, quote, high-status Creeks began to trade for and utilize African slaves to the benefit of the Creeks' agrarian way of life. They would farm cotton on their own plantations, and some Creeks would amass significant wealth in comparison to their centuries-long history that came before these cross-Atlantic influences began to reshape their society. While the, quote, rope of sand had connected the clans together, and given them a shared interest of which to defend against attacks by settlers and rival tribes alike, it was without a truly authoritative figure atop the tribal structure. With no way to rule for or against this use of human chattel, a schism occurred within the various clans, and several Creeks would relocate to South Florida. Due to the depopulationary events of the prior Spanish plagues that ravaged the local native peoples, land for these withdrawing Creeks was readily abundant. The Spanish would refer to the newly arrived natives as Cimarron, meaning runaways or wild ones. This would, over time, evolve into the name they are known by to this day, Seminole. They would establish communities that implemented European-style farms and ranching, and, informed in part by their divergence from the Creeks, they would grow in size as a haven for escaped black slaves, whether they were, quote, owned by American, Spanish, or even Creek entities. These, quote, black Seminoles would adopt the way of life of the welcoming natives, who required they maintain their own settlements, offer up tributes of crops annually, and fight alongside the Seminoles against their American adversaries. The disputes between the United States and the, quote, Red Sticks and Creeks, of whom the Seminoles were born from, dated far back into the past, with many attacks, skirmishes, and uprisings occurring in what in hindsight appears to be a never-ending conflict. Most recently, the Red Stick War was fought over the course of a year, spanning from the summer of 1813 to the summer of 1814. It was both a territorial dispute between the empires of the United States, Spain, and Great Britain, but also was effectively a civil war among the Creeks. The war would be ended with the signing of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, resulting in Andrew Jackson securing the surrender of 21 million acres of land in southern Georgia and central Alabama, at the cost of 2,000 casualties, the majority of which belonged to the alliance opposing the United States. With factions within factions fighting one another, and the presence of European nation-states forming alliances with and against themselves and various tribes as the ever-evolving situation saw fit, it is fair to say that the layers of nuance held within each particular conflict that occurred over the territory of North America can at times carry upon itself a dense veneer of murky indistinguishability. What the Red Stick War undeniably managed to do, however, was bring the Seminole Nation into the direct focus of General Andrew Jackson and the United States government. For context, General Jackson had famously demolished the British invasion of New Orleans just 18 months prior to the grisly events that would occur at Negro Fort, and the Seminole proclivity for both assisting the British as well as harboring fugitive slaves had been a significant point of contention for Old Hickory. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 authorized the government to seize and return escapees to their owners and incur penalties against those who aided in their fight. This would serve as a pretext for the actions the United States would authorize in their expedition into the Spanish-held territory. The fort that held several hundred escaped slaves who had worked with the British in the War of 1812, having been built by the Brits in 1815, stood in present-day Franklin County in the Florida Panhandle. If Jackson wanted to mobilize a force to attack the fort, he would need the authorization given to him by the current Commander-in-Chief, James Madison. Madison had previously authorized force to support rebellions against Spain by residents of West Florida. While he had first exercised patience and restraint in the matter, by March of 1816 he ordered Jackson to inform the governor of West Florida, Mauricio de Zuniga, that the laws of nations required them to come together to, quote, put an end to an evil of so serious a nature. Ultimately, the decision would fall to Madison on whether force would be used to take the fort and if it needed congressional approval. Andrew Jackson did not wait, and instead would set forth the military operation that would result in the assault on Negro Fort. Jackson wrote to General Gaines telling him, quote, you possess the power of acting on your own discretion, which I hope you will exercise on this. West Florida Governor Mauricio de Zuniga would respond to Jackson's earlier correspondence regarding the Negro Fort that, quote, the Spanish government needed to destroy or remove from our frontier this banditti, put an end to an evil of so serious a nature, and return to our citizens and the friendly Indians inhabiting our territory those Negroes now in the said fort and which have been stolen and enticed from them. This response further emboldened Jackson to take actions to address Negro Fort. The operation began the last week of June 1816 with U.S. gunboats and schooners headed for Apalachicola Bay. Arriving on July 10th, they carried with them guns, provisions, and supplies. The gunboats weighed upward of 25 tons. They each carried 50 sailors with several large cannons stretching over 60 feet in length. The destruction per capita offered by these vessels was practically unrivaled. The naval vessels would meet up with Allied Creek Chief Lafarca at the mouth of the Apalachicola. Colonel Clinch had ordered them to hold their position, and he then began his movement south from Camp Crawford with 116 men on July 17th in well-armed and reinforced flatboats. Clinch would link up with Chief William McIntosh and his 150 Coweta warriors. He then added another detachment of Creeks the following day, under the command of Mad Tiger. The arrangement between Clinch and the native chiefs in regards to compensation was $50 for every captured slave. The natives were also given the right of first refusal when it came to looting the fort after its capture. The first shot of the Battle of Negro Fort was fired on July 15th, as the advance of gunboats and schooners of the Americans saw a group of men pulling a small vessel out of the water ahead of them. One American boat went forth to approach the party and was fired upon with a volley of musket balls that struck into the boat. 2 days after this, Sailing Master Loomis sent a small boat with 4 sailors up the river in search of fresh water. They spied a black man standing alone on the riverbank, then docked their vessel and went ashore to speak with the man. And just as they had done so, no fewer than 40 black and native men appeared brandishing muskets. With them was their commander, Garçon. They opened fire and took the lives of 3 of the sailors at once. Another sailor, John Lopez, was wounded but managed to escape via swimming the waters of the river. The worst fate would, however, fall upon the man they captured, Edward Daniels, who was taken to the fort, heavily tarred, and then burned alive. Over the coming days, varying reports of success had been documented regarding the ability of the American native forces to capture fleeing slaves, one of whom held the scalp of Edward Daniels in his hand when he was overtaken by McIntosh's Coweta warriors. He was on his way to show off his trophy to the Seminoles as proof of their actions and the hostilities that were now underway. The next several days were, in relative terms, fairly uneventful. The defenders of Fort Negro used the artillery and weaponry within the structure to keep the encroaching men at a distance. Shot, shell, grape, and rockets would serve as a capable deterrent, but would do little to inflict significant damage upon the American native allies, who were content to let the fortification burn through their munitions as they took cover. The black defenders of the fort at one point launched an offensive raid against the Coweta warriors. The engagement was conducted in such close quarters that muskets were of little effect, with the bulk of the ferocious fighting being undertaken with tomahawks and knives. These clashes persisted for the better part of 3 days, before the Coweta gained a clear advantage and the black, quote, Maroons, as they had often been called, made their return within the fort. The American Dr. Buck would recount after observing this gruesome, days-long clash of hand-to-hand fighting, quote, even though they were Indians, Negroes, and our enemies, it was clear that they were determined to fight to the end, and never to be taken alive. McIntosh would then destroy all of the fruit, corn, and livestock surrounding the fort, and a small collection of native leaders approached the fort to demand it be surrendered. The party was met with considerable disdain, and the leader, Garçon, informed them that he had been left in command by the authority of the British government, and his orders were to sink any American vessels who attempted to pass beyond them. Though it had been over a year since the British had abandoned the fort and the War of 1812 ended, they still held out hope that they would be reinforced and relieved by the British in time. Surrendering was of little incentive, as they were aware of the objective of the American native forces to return them to their, quote, legal slaveholders. On the 26th of July, Clinch's army and Loomis's navy would finally be joined together several miles below Prospect Bluff. Then, a detachment of soldiers was sent to the rear of the fort to join the Cowetas under McIntosh. The following morning, on the 27th, the gunboats would be positioned along the river within cannon shot of the fort. This brought a cannonade upon the American native positions from the guns within the fort, but it did little damage. The position of his gunboats, however, was described by Loomis as, quote, point-blank range. For the next hour, the sides exchanged voluminous cannon fire, with neither gaining a clear advantage. It wasn't until the American sailing master upon gunboat 154 began to heat the shells with a makeshift furnace that the battle would be abruptly decided. The red-hot cannonball was launched from the vessel, cutting through the dewy, dense air of the Florida summer morning with devilish intent. It passed high above the fort's outer perimeter and crashed directly into the gunpowder magazine arsenal. Instantly, a deafening eruption that was said to be heard as far as 100 miles away ignited in an enormous fireball that could be seen high above the walls of the fortification, at once immolating, concussing, and launching into the air hundreds of men, women, and children that inhabited the structure. Dr. Buck would somberly recount this dreadful exhibition. Quote, "You cannot conceive, nor I describe, the horrors of the scene. In an instant, hundreds of lifeless bodies were stretched upon the plain, buried in sand and rubbish, or suspended from the tops of the surrounding pines. The soldiers, while relieved with the almost instantaneous resolution to the battle, were taken aback by the utter devastation they had just laid bare." Buck continued, "They checked their celebrations to drop a tear on the distressing scene." Accounts of the casualties vary amongst primary sources, but the consensus lies that roughly 300 individuals described as fugitive slaves and at least 25 of their Choctaw allies were present within the fort during the explosion, with roughly only 25 of them in total surviving the battle's concise and fiery conclusion. McIntosh's Cowitas began butchering all of the black survivors of the explosion quite literally before the dust had even settled. Colonel Clinch would hurry into the ruins of the fort and pled for the massacre to cease. Some feel he did this because it appealed to his sense of humanity. Others state that he merely wanted them alive because they were rightfully the property of slave owners, and it was his mission to return them. Improbable as it was, Garçon and a nameless Choctaw had survived the blast. Immediately upon their apprehension, they were tried for the murder of the 4 sailors at the outset of the battle. In their final act of defiance, they took responsibility for the killings and were promptly scalped and shot. Seminole leader Neamathla was angered by the destruction of the fort that caused the death of the members of his people. He would send a warning to General Gaines that should his forces cross the Flint River, they would come under attack by the Seminoles. General Gaines would respond by sending a detachment to arrest Neamathla, which would erupt in a barbarous confrontation. After the Battle of Negro Fort, all of the pieces were finally in place for the First Seminole War, and what would follow would invoke a series of utterly jarring acts of violence. But the tales of depredation and destruction in the First Seminole War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. January 24th, 1599. Acoma Pueblo, New Mexico. 26-year-old Spanish conquistador Vicente de Zaldivar stares angrily into the pre-dawn darkness, mentally rehearsing the plan he and his officers have agreed to. They will make a head-on charge, it has been decided. Their cannon will be put to use. And before the sun sets on another chilly winter's day, de Zaldivar feels assured that victory will belong to himself and his men. They have been ensconced here at the base of this mesa and the sparse expanses of this unforgiving desert for 2 days, laying siege to the natives within the adobe brick walls. But despite their formidable advantage in both firepower and personnel, they have been, as of yet, unable to overtake their intended objective. Their presence here is the inevitable result of 2 worlds colliding. While they are ultimately only the martial enforcement of policies dictated by a king and influenced by a pope, thousands of miles away, the actions they are about to take will ultimately have reverberations felt throughout both the new and old worlds. However, while geopolitics indeed plays a role in the attack these soldiers of Spain are about to undertake, they are here today primarily for the sake of their own personal vengeance and retribution. In little more than a century since Christopher Columbus's landing in the Caribbean, Spain's relentless incursion into the Americas has been rivaled only by the British, the French, and the Dutch. Following Hernán Cortés's overthrow of the Aztecs in 1519, the Spanish spread north and westward has been startlingly swift and strikingly violent. The Spanish had founded New Spain, encompassing the vast majority of what today comprises both Central and North Americas, in 1521. For much of the latter half of the 16th century, the Spanish had concentrated significant amounts of their efforts on settling the area. The Spanish and the Acoma people had first come into contact around the year 1540, and for decades had lived in essentially peaceful coexistence. However, in the preceding few years, the Spanish attempts at subjugating the Pueblo peoples of what is today central and northern New Mexico had become both more concentrated and more consistent. The Spanish governor, Don Oñate, had spent considerable time and resources on settling the region and bringing the native inhabitants to bear as subjects of both the Spanish crown and, simultaneously, the Catholic Church. In 1595, Oñate was granted permission from King Philip II to colonize Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, the present-day state of New Mexico. This led to his involvement in devising a plan to overthrow the Acoma chieftains and conquer their pueblo by force. With the full weight of the Spanish crown's oversight now upon them, Oñate feels the Acoma can no longer be allowed to run unfettered about the Spanish territory as unbaptized, disobedient citizens. However, in 1598, his plans for a violent overthrow had leaked to the Acoma, who were rightfully incensed and understandably terrified. Among many Acoma, it was still believed that the Spanish were, with their steel armor and cacophonous firearms, impervious to harm. Also adding to the Spanish air of invincibility is their exclusive access to a technology no natives on the American continent possess: the horse. Since landing in the New World, horses and horsemanship had been closely guarded aspects of European technology that it was believed must never be allowed to fall into native hands. This perception of the Spanish, as well as the Spanish's well-known track record of harshly dealing with their opposition, had led many among the Acoma to advocate for a conciliatory approach to dealing with the Spanish. Well aware of the Acoma's willingness to acquiesce, Don Oñate had sent his nephew, Vicente de Salvador's brother, Juan, to negotiate a peace agreement with the Acoma. This was seen as a plum assignment and a way to pad the budding young Juan's record as a diplomat and military leader. On December 4, 1598, Juan de Zaldivar had marched up the steep slopes of the mesa with 16 conquistadors under his command and resolutely demanded food. Their trek had been tiresome, and they were indeed in great need of sustenance, but their presumption and aggression had quickly led to a violent altercation with the Acoma. The conquistadors had allegedly assaulted some of the Acoma women, actions which led to the death of Juan de Zaldivar and 11 of the 16 soldiers under his charge. Upon receiving the news of his nephew's demise at the hands of the Acoma, Don Oñate had flown into a rage, promising revenge against them. It was Oñate who had ordered Vicente de Zaldivar to lead the expedition avenging his brother's death. Vicente and his men had arrived at the Acoma Pueblo on January 21st of 1599, and the battle had begun in earnest on the following morning. The formidable walls surrounding the pueblo had, for 2 days, held the attempts of the Spanish to infiltrate them at bay. Repeated incursions had been made with the hope of a headlong charge being avoided, as well as avoiding the arduous task of hauling their field cannons up the steep, rocky slopes in order to breach the walls. Now, just before the sun's rays pierced the eastern skyline, Vicente de Zaldivar gives his force of roughly 70 men the order to advance. Huddled inside their homes, quieting their children and steeling their own nerves, the Acoma can hear the clattering of the armored Spaniards advancing up the slopes with their artillery in tow. Though they have witnessed the Spanish fire upon them in the preceding few days with their arquebuses, the Acoma have yet to face the full brunt of the Spanish cannons. Though far shorter than their maritime counterparts, the field cannons carried by the Spanish on this day provide a powerful tactical as well as a psychological advantage. The walls of the adobe, though expertly constructed and remarkably durable, are no match for cannonballs. The deafening roar of the cannons also provides a factor of shock and awe that are of comparable, if not equal, value in attacking an enemy as of yet unfamiliar with their capabilities. Just as the morning sun has risen high enough to illuminate the strange actions of the Spaniards, As they make ready to fire, the Acoma look on in equal parts curiosity and horror. Moments later, the command to fire the first volley is given, and the placid sounds of the desert morning are instantly drowned out in a roar of cannon fire. Of the estimated 6,000 Acoma inhabitants, roughly 2,000 are full-fledged warriors, now readying themselves for a third successive day of resisting the Spanish onslaught. As they watch the damage being steadily inflicted upon the outer walls of the Pueblo, they come to the chilling realization that soon the only barrier between the cannon fire and their families will be themselves. The Spanish onslaught continues, as the wailing and lamentations of the women and children fill the air. As cannonballs continue to plow into the thick walls, the complications for the defending Acoma begin to compound. Soon, in addition to the emerging gap in the defensive wall, the smell of acrid smoke permeates the air. The dried straw mixed into the adobe has begun to smolder with the incessant heat of the cannonballs assaulting it. Soon, the fire is growing rapidly, as are the panicked cries of the men, women, and children, now all trapped within the confines of the Pueblo. Finally, after hours of bombardment, Vicente de Zalvadar gives the final command for the conquistadors to draw their swords and storm the Pueblo. Within minutes, the several dozen heavily armed and highly trained soldiers pour past the barriers of the walls and into the city streets of the Pueblo. For hours, a bitter, vicious battle rages, in which the Spanish cut down even the most tacit opposition, be they warriors, women, or children. By late afternoon, the Acoma Pueblo's peaceable confines have turned into a smoke-strewn, blood-soaked scene from a nightmare. Roughly 500 Acoma warriors lie dead, most having died courageously in vicious hand-to-hand combat defending their loved ones. Additionally, roughly 300 women and children have fallen to Spanish swords and arquebus fire. Now, as the afternoon sun begins to wane, Vicente de Zaldivar, still seething over the death of his brother, orders 500 of the Acoma villagers placed in chains. Amidst the weeping of children and mothers who would never see each other again, the Spanish summarily marched the captured Acoma off to the San Juan Pueblo, where Governor Don Oñate waits with an abiding fury. Upon his arrival, Vicente de Zaldivar is made the object of Oñate's praise, and the prisoners are made the target of his merciless rage. Initially, the seething Oñate ordered that every male over the age of 25 should have their right foot cut off, and subsequently enslaved for 20 years. The same period of enslavement was to befall any male prisoner between the ages of 12 and 25, and any female prisoners over the age of 12. Ultimately, 24 of the captured warriors would suffer the totality of their sentences. The rest would be dispersed throughout the Jesuit mission system that had already been established even here on the furthest outreaches of the Spanish frontier. Many of the younger women would ultimately be sent to convents in Mexico City to serve out lives as nuns. 2 of the male prisoners had their hands amputated and were sent out amongst the neighboring tribes as walking warning signs not to contest the newly declared authority of the Spanish crown. It would be King Philip II himself, however, who would issue a personal order banishing Don Oñate from the entirety of the New Mexico territory for good. Even with the ostensible might of one of Europe's most powerful empires backing them, it was readily apparent to the king that such needlessly violent retributive actions would only ultimately cause the Spanish more problems in their attempts to advance their empire and grow their economy. Oñate would eventually retire to Spain, where he would work as the head of all mining inspectors until his death in 1626. Don Oñate presents an incredibly controversial and consequential figure in the story of the Spanish in the New World. He is vilified by many, revered by some, and often heralded as the last of the conquistadors. The end of his story is, however, far from the end of the story of the Spanish incursion into what is today North, Central, and South America. The actions taken by Don Oñate would have consequences that reverberated for decades, ultimately culminating in the largest native revolt in North American history. The tales of bloodshed, coexistence, survival, and heroism are too numerous to cover in a single episode. And so, for tonight, they are other stories for other times. Northern California, June 25, 1846. In the burgeoning heat of the summer morning, the small village of Sonoma stirs with children at play, animals stirring, and citizens conducting business and carrying out chores. For weeks now, the small hamlet situated just north of San Francisco has been caught up in a groundswell of political upheaval that has been fostering amongst the American immigrants to this territory still owned by Mexico. Roughly 2 weeks earlier, 2 Americans named Fowler and Cowie had ventured to Bodega Bay from Sonoma in hopes of procuring arms and ammunition. They had been caught en route by Mexican guerrilla forces and, after being tied to a pair of oak trees and tortured, had been hanged. On June 14, 1846, the town had been taken over by men claiming it in the name of the Bear Flag Republic. Roughly 30 men, under the leadership of 40-year-old former mountain man Ezekiel Stuttering Zeke Merritt, had taken over Sonoma to essentially no resistance. The founder and mayor of the town, General Mariano Vallejo, is placed under arrest, and a white flag with a makeshift bear on it is raised over the town. The news of this action reaches California Governor Pio Pico, who orders Captain Joaquin de la Torre to take a contingent of soldiers under his command and quash this troublesome rebellion. But, much to his dismay, de la Torre has been repeatedly repulsed by the Americans, who are now calling themselves osos, or bears. The news of this action also soon reaches the ears of one Captain John C. Fremont. Though ostensibly on an exploratory mission at the behest of the United States government, Fremont has long fostered hopes that the Americans living in Mexico's Alta California would rebel against their overseers and annex California in the name of the United States. Now, the ambitious army officer who has advanced to the odd but prestigious position of military officer in charge of a scientific expedition is heartened to hear that his hopes have become a reality. Fremont and his party have spent the previous few years carrying out a variety of exploratory missions that have seen them cover vast expanses of the American West, and California in particular. They have survived all manner of privation, hardship, and travail. Just weeks prior, 3 members of their party had been killed by native warriors believed to be Modocs on the shores of what is today Oregon's Klamath Lake. Though many in the band are experienced mountain men and soldiers, they all readily acquiesce to the fact that they owe their survival, in large part, to the efforts of their legendary guide, Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. Though only 36 years old, Kit Carson is already a legendary figure on the American frontier. Tales of his daring exploits in fighting native warriors, trapping little-known areas, and surviving all manner of wilderness hardships are well known by many on the eastern seaboard due to the popularity of the dime novels bearing his name. Though many are largely, or entirely, fictionalized, and Carson himself often bristles at any mention of his own celebrity, he is a celebrity nonetheless. However, despite his notoriety, Carson is a steadfastly dutiful and loyal man, whose already fastidious obedience to Fremont's authority has been even further solidified since the officer saved his life after riding his imposing war horse, a large gray steed named Sacramento, over a native warrior who had drawn an arrow on Carson in the woods of southern Oregon. The fact that this had likely saved his life is not lost on the legendary mountain man, and when Fremont suddenly gives the order that the party will make their way to Sonoma to reinforce and oversee the rebel forces, Carson obeys without question. Now, as the party makes its way into the small town during this sweltering morning on June 25th, the townsfolk are brought to a momentary pause. The men, who have for the most part made their homes in the wilderness for the preceding several months, cause quite a stir with the spectacle they present amidst the comparatively genteel townsfolk. In their trek southward to Sonoma, they have taken on several volunteers, and now present a buckskin-clad, ill-kempt, and unshaven multinational spectacle to the observing Sonomans. One among them commented that Fremont's group was composed of Americans, French, English, Swiss, Poles, Russians, Chileans, Germans, Greeks, Austrians, and Pawnees, and if de la Torre could beat them, he could beat the whole world. Within a matter of days, Fremont has taken over the town and taken over leadership of the rebellion. As the ranking military officer for hundreds of miles, Fremont exercises his martial authority over the rebels and promises them protection for their obedience. The settlers of Sonoma agree. even acquiescing to Fremont's request to formally move the recognized start date of the rebellion to coincide with his arrival, to defer all military and civil command to him, and to refer to him as Oso I. He begins signing all letters and dispatches Captain John C. Fremont, Commander-in-Chief of Military Forces in California, and orders the Osos under his command to iron and confine any person who shall disobey your commands, and to shoot any person who shall endanger the safety of the town. Among the Americans now caught in the fray of revolutionary politics and policing is Johann Sutter, a German-born, Swiss-descended immigrant who, in but a few years' time, will change California history forever with the discovery of gold at his lumber mill on the American River. However, now, in 1846, he is simply a prominent local who is beginning to find Fremont's methods distasteful, if not outright untenable. But when Sutter opposes the extremity of Fremont's orders to the ever more haughty officer's face, Fremont scornfully responds that if Sutter has any problems with his leadership, he can simply join up with the Mexican army. Such dismissiveness and self-importance begins to become more and more the order of the day for those dealing with Fremont. He expects those under his command to exhibit only loyalty, obedience, and discipline. One among his party who he can always count on to embody these traits is Kit Carson. Despite his advantage in both experience and ability, Carson time and again plays the part of dutiful sideman, seeing fit only to follow and enforce, but never to lead. However, Carson's reticence to command suits Fremont perfectly, and, of course, when Fremont decides within a few days of arriving in Sonoma that he must take the offensive and pursue Captain de la Torre, he chooses Kit Carson to accompany himself and a small contingent as they set out to engage the Mexican commander on his own ground. The party makes its way southwest from Sonoma to San Rafael, situated just north of San Francisco Bay. On their march, they intercept a Mexican army courier carrying dispatches from Captain de la Torre himself. Following the intelligence gleaned from the intercepted dispatches, Fremont leads the party straight to the northern shores of San Francisco Bay, near present-day San Quentin. However, the courier he has intercepted, as well as the information that the man carries, are all part of a carefully planned ruse being carried out by Captain de la Torre. When the Fremont party arrives on the shores of San Francisco Bay on Sunday, June 28, 1846, they are greeted by a confusingly empty expanse of coastline where they had expected to meet lines of Mexican soldiers ready to meet them in battle. Fremont is both embarrassed and incensed. His hopes of a swift and glorious victory have not only been dashed, but he has been made a fool of by the Mexican officer's clever deception. How, Fremont wonders, can he possibly conduct a successful war against an enemy who refuses to fight and who he cannot find? As the party of men lingers on the shores of the shallow bay, Fremont ponders his next move. He intends to take California by sweeping southward, from San Francisco to Santa Barbara, then on to Los Angeles and San Diego. But now, instead of a decisive victory, he has let his enemy slip away. Then, Fremont spots a small rowboat crossing the bay, headed for shore near he and his party's location. The small vessel makes its way through the brackish, chilly waters to the shoreline, where 3 men disembark and come ashore. They are 20-year-old Ramon de Haro and his twin brother, Francisco de Haro. They are sons of Don Francisco de Haro, former alcalde of San Francisco during the years of 1834, as well as 1838 through 1839. They are accompanied by their uncle, José de los Reyes Berriesa. Though the 3 are clearly civilians and not party to the actions of the Mexican military, Fremont orders Carson to detain them and search them for documents. Carson barks at the confused and increasingly fearful men to hand over any correspondence that they have on their person. All 3 insist that they have none, and are simply on a personal errand to meet friends and family in Sonoma. Carson, still unsure whether the men are telling the truth, calls out to Fremont, who is impatiently seated on his horse roughly 50 yards away. "Should I take these men prisoners?" he asks Fremont. "I have no use for prisoners," responds Fremont. Carson momentarily confers with other members of the party. What had Fremont meant, they wonder. Again, Fremont barks at Carson. "Mr. Carson, your duty." This final admonishment hangs in the air for a pregnant moment as the gravity of Fremont's command settles on Carson and his cohorts. The matter, it seems, has already been decided. Without an instant more of hesitation, Carson whirls, pistol in hand, towards the three confused and frightened men. Suddenly, the cacophony of gunfire roars out along the narrow strip of coastline. At almost the same instant, 20-year-old Ramon de Haro falls to the ground, mortally wounded. Before he is able to fully comprehend what is happening, Francisco de Haro falls, mortally wounded, as a second shot rings out from Carson's pistol. Now, as his two nephews lie on the beach rapidly expiring, the elderly Berryessa cries out in confusion and grief. His bereaved cries pierce the air until he, too, is cut down by a final shot from Carson's pistol. Moments later, all three men, who had only minutes before been paddling across the waters of the bay, all lie still in death. Fremont is, for the time being, satisfied, and Carson, for his part, seems altogether unbothered by the gruesome event. The entire affair, however brief, presents a confounding picture to both contemporary observers and to those viewing the events through the lens of posterity. While it might seem clear to most that Fremont's vainglorious nature provided the catalyst for the murders of three innocent citizens, Carson's lack of hesitation or consternation has been a cause for much confusion. While many might attribute his actions to racial motives, Carson was himself married to a Mexican citizen named Josefa Jaramillo, whom he was fiercely devoted to, and had even converted to Catholicism in order to marry. The couple had several children who were not only of mixed blood, but mixed culture, being raised in the inexorable cultural milieu of Santa Fe, the couple's lifelong home. Carson also had been married previously to two different Native American women, one of whom had borne him children. Suffice to say, racial prejudices were likely not the driving force in Carson's cold-blooded executions of the de Haro twins and the elderly Berryessa. Nor was Carson party to the fits of jingoistic fervor that so often enraptured his cohorts and countrymen. Though certainly a proud American citizen and at least a tacit adherent to the doctrine of manifest destiny, Carson did not possess an overt passion for the expansion of his country at any and all costs. To Carson, the West was a real place, alive with cultures, conflicts, commodities, and compromise, not an abstract notion that could be conquered in the name of politicians and policymakers. However, with all that said, Carson was a man with an unwavering allegiance to authority. He was largely illiterate, and had not been privy to the higher education and high society that many of his superiors had been. Carson, despite his record and reputation, felt a seemingly unshakable sense of inferiority when interacting with those imbued with governmental or societal authority. Such was the case concerning his relationship with John C. Fremont. Fremont's pedigree, connections, and title carried such significant weight in Carson's mind that even questioning the officer's intentions seems to have been an essentially unthinkable affront to duty and honor. Further cementing Carson's steadfast loyalty were the events of just a few weeks prior, when Fremont had saved Carson's life on the shores of Klamath Lake. He felt, rightfully so in this case, that he owed his life to Fremont. Fremont, meanwhile, though holding Carson's skill in high regard, seems to have been more than willing to sacrifice the lives of three innocent men on the altar of revolution, and to have used Carson as a means of keeping his hands free from the stain of actual blood. Though he had spent many years building his reputation and legacy via treacherous backwoods expeditions, as well as dining-room diplomacy, Fremont sees the revolution at hand against the Mexican government to be his big chance at lasting fame and fortune. He believes that without his explicit direction and assistance, the Bear Flaggers are doomed to fail against the mighty Mexican army. He also believes that this revolutionary fervor for independence can be tempered to perfectly suit the desires of the American government in fulfilling the edicts of manifest destiny. Finally, he believes that with the killing of Fowler and Cowie, the two Sonoman citizens who had been cruelly tortured and killed by Mexican guerrillas, any and all violent retribution employed against any military-aged male, with even suspected allegiance to the Mexican government, are justifiable actions completely in keeping with military norms. Whatever the why behind either man's actions, though, there is still the matter of the what exactly the men should do next. Captain de la Torre has managed to slip away, and while he is temporarily disadvantaged, he is rapidly heading south to notify his superiors in San Francisco that the Americans in and around Sonoma have now risen up and officially spilled blood in the name of their revolution. Word will soon spread south to Los Angeles, San Diego, and before long, to Mexico City. The response from the Mexican government, Fremont expects, will be swift and merciless, and will soon overrun the Bear Flag rebels. Should Fremont command his party to return to Sonoma, they will be left to wait to receive a series of sizable, relentless attacks from an opposing force with massive advantages in both numbers and firepower. Fremont finds this option unsuitable for both tactical and political reasons. Should the moment at hand not be seized, the fight for California could prove to be a much longer affair than either himself or the nation have anticipated. Thus, Fremont decides to carry on with the initial plan of attack, heading southward down the California coast. 2 weeks after the killing of the Diaro brothers in Berryessa, Fremont leads his party to Monterey. Here, he will link up with the American naval vessels that dock in the bay, and, after another inconsequential engagement with the Mexican army, continue the march southwards towards Los Angeles. It is at Los Angeles that Fremont will task Carson with his most ambitious endeavor to date. Carson is charged with taking a small party of men and making the transcontinental trek from Southern California to Washington, D.C., with the intention of delivering correspondence from Fremont directly to President James K. Polk. Carson is, for his part, enthralled with the task. He sees this as his long-awaited opportunity to finally rub elbows with the cultural and political elites whose decisions and litigations had for so long shaped his life from afar. The plan is for Carson to then lead reinforcements to Los Angeles to assist Fremont in the final stages of overtaking California from the Mexican government. He will also, by design, be able to stop off in Santa Fe to visit his beloved wife and children. However, neither Carson's plans for a transcontinental odyssey nor Fremont's plans for an easy conquest will come to fruition in quite the way that either man has planned. But for tonight, the tale of Carson's journey to meet the president, as well as that of Fremont's fight to take California and solidify his fortune and legacy, are other stories for other times. October 1768, northern New Mexico. As dawn breaks on another autumnal morning, the inhabitants of the Spanish garrison at Ojo Caliente, just north of the Rio Grande, wake from another fitful night's sleep, casting watchful eyes to the north. Though the surrounding area was well known for its relentless desert heat, conditions could vary wildly from freezing cold to thunderstorms to unyielding droughts. However, regardless of the conditions they awoke to, the soldiers present at Ojo Caliente did this every morning. For these men, who believed themselves courageous soldiers of the Spanish Empire, lived in stark terror of one thing more than any other here in this harsh locale on the bleeding edge of the known world. They lived in constant fear not of disease, nor attack from other European powers, nor even attack from most of the local native tribes whom they had either driven out or fully subjugated. They lived in fear of the Comanche, the black-clad, black-painted horsemen of death who had been wreaking havoc on the western edges of the frontier for decades now. The Spanish had, ironically, sown the seeds of their own downfall on essentially the same day Hernán Cortés had reached the mainland of Central America in the early 1500s. For, as history would bear out, the introduction of the horse to the New World would prove not only a defining moment in history, but an essentially unavoidable transference of a technology upon which much of the succeeding history would hinge. In the 2 centuries since the horse had been introduced to the North American continent, the collective population of horses in the New World gradually made their way northward via trade, theft, and inborn wanderlust. During the same time, the Comanche had undertaken a mass migration southward, breaking off from their Shoshone forefathers in what is present-day Wyoming and making their way down the eastern side of the Rockies, often harassed by tribes local to the areas they passed through. However, sometime in the mid to early 1600s, the Comanche had come into contact with the horse, and, in what amounts to the historical blink of an eye, they had gone from bipedal whipping boys to some of the most adept cavalrymen on the planet. Their turnaround had been stark, swift, and startlingly violent. Their longtime foes, tribes like the Apache, were driven from their homelands in Texas and New Mexico. Comanche raids, though, were not solely military endeavors intent on killing their enemies and taking their lands. They were the means by which the Comanche economy ran. The spoils of victory, be they weapons, horses, foodstuffs, or oftentimes captives who were treated as subhuman slaves. The Comanche were notorious for the brutal treatment they inflicted upon their prisoners. While adoption of younger captives was not wholly uncommon, the abuse and subjugation of female captives was the norm. The Comanche viewed the captives that they adopted as fully recognized members of the tribe, but viewed those they did not as something altogether less than human, and they treated them as such. The Comanche dealt in an extensive, empire-wide slave trade that rivaled or equaled the transatlantic and Arabic slave trades in their brutality and inhumanity, if not in transcontinental scope. While there was certainly a market for powerful, wealthy New Mexican oligarchs to purchase back captives to return to their families, there was also a large market for slave labor among the wealthy ranchers and politicians of the territory. A resident Spanish Catholic priest at Ojo Viejo, Fray Andres Varro, gave the following first-hand account of one of the many trade fairs that were held for the Comanche by many of the local New Mexico governors in various locations throughout large swaths of eastern and southern New Mexico. Quote, "Here, in short, is gathered everything possible for trade and barter with these barbarians in exchange for buffalo hides, and, what is saddest, in exchange for Indian slave, men and women, small and large, and a great multitude of both sexes, for they are the gold and silver and richest treasures of the governors." Fray Varro goes on to describe, in horrified tones, the treatment of the female captives by the Comanche. Quote, "They corrupt them in sight of innumerable assemblies of barbarians and Catholics, saying to those who buy them with heathen imprudence, 'Now you can take her. Now she is good.'" The Comanche, no strangers to psychological warfare, used the accounts of their raids and treatment of prisoners to stir up terror and build an aura of invincibility throughout the burgeoning empire. However, they also contrasted their propensity for startling levels of violence with a keen sense of diplomacy. Throughout the decades, they had alternately established, renounced, and re-established several peace treaties with different townships in the area. However, the decentralized structure of Comanche society made any kind of sustainable peace agreement nearly impossible to establish. Though they were often referred to as a singular nation, the Comanche did not operate as one unified entity. Rather, several autonomous bands comprised what was known on its whole as the Comanche Nation. Before the 1750s, three primary bands comprised the Comanche: the Yamparicas, the Jupes, and the Catzotecas. By the 19th century, the diaspora of Comanche bands had expanded significantly. By this point, many observers of the Comanche began to refer to them in three distinct groups: the Northern Comanche, the Middle Comanche, and the Southern Comanche. The Yamparica, or root eaters, and the Catzoteca, or buffalo eaters, occupied the northernmost areas of Comancheria, in present-day Kansas and Colorado. The Noconi, or movers, held sway over the eastern reaches in present-day New Mexico. Located south of them were the Tenawa, or those who lived downstream, as well as the Tanima, or liver eaters. These groups were known as the Middle Comanche. The Panateca, or honey eaters, occupied the Edwards Plateau in central Texas. They were the largest band and known as the Southern Comanche. Other bands would continue to break off and operate as autonomous but cohesive entities well into the 19th century. The Coahati, or antelope eaters, moved onto the plains of the Llano Estacado in Texas in the 19th centuries, and by the 19th century, they were known as the Western Comanche. These ever-evolving intra-tribal dynamics made attaining a tribal-wide consensus on anything from peace treaties to trading agreements a nearly impossible task. The Spanish had come to these northernmost outreaches of their self-proclaimed empire in the 16th century, bringing with them cattle, sheep, agriculture, Catholicism, firearms, and horses. They had swept north after conquering the Aztecs, either subjugating or eliminating the native tribes they had encountered on their deliberate, decisive push into the territories of the New World. By 1768, Taos and Santa Fe had been established trading spots for centuries. They were also subject to the constantly alternating and occasionally simultaneous Comanche practices of trading with and making raids upon the local ranches and outposts. 3 months before this October morning, a band of 400 Comanche, believed to have been Katzoteca, had made their way into Taos, roughly 40 miles east of Ojo Caliente, under the auspices of desiring peaceful trade with the local merchants. This was not altogether uncommon, though it must have been an unnerving experience for even the most inveterate traders and Taos residents. On this day, though, the Comanche had not only been peaceable, they had been downright amiable. Smiles and charity were the order of the day, as residents traded and bartered, conversed and competed in horse races and games of chance. But in the Comanches' joviality lay their Machiavellian genius. Though they had no knowledge of the cynical 16th century Italian political philosopher, it is safe to assume that the Comanches would likely have appreciated his work if they did. For they viewed themselves as rightful rulers of a seemingly endless domain, ones who did not have the luxury of indulging in moral scrupulosity when they had an empire to run. This trading contingent had certainly come to Taos to trade and acquire goods, but they were also a distraction. For on that same morning, a group of 100 Katzoteca warriors had swept down upon the Spanish at Ojo Caliente. Despite their best attempts on that day, though, the Comanche attack had failed. The Spanish soldiers, well armed and well trained, had managed to respond in time to the Comanche attack, killing and injuring a number of Comanche warriors within the first few volleys. Like virtually all native tribes on the North and South American continent, the Comanche martial tradition did not include sacrificing the lives of their warriors to make territorial gains. The remaining warriors retreated across the nearby river, with a number being lost to drowning. 1 or 2 of the riders were sent as messengers to alert their brethren in Taos, while the remainder fled to the open expanses of the prairie to the north. When they were informed of the loss of their fellow tribesmen, the Comanche there also rapidly exited the territory, rejoining their brethren from the raiding party in the north, but not before killing 5 Spanish settlers and 1 Tauseño native. Once reunited with the raiding party, they undoubtedly engaged in the traditional Comanche mourning practices, self-mortification, which might take place anywhere on a spectrum from cutting one's hair short to lopping off digits, as well as the killing of the slain warrior's horses and the dispensation of his family and property amongst the rest of the tribe. However, once the physical and emotional wounds caused by the losses of loved ones healed, the next order of business was, as is all too common in the human experience, revenge. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months of mornings just like this, in which the Spanish soldiers would wake from a fitful night's sleep, check their weapons, and make ready for their day. Every morning, they had wondered if that morning might be the morning that they would see the dreaded silhouettes of Comanches riding at them at full bore, returning to exact their pound of flesh for the wrongs done to them. 4 weeks before this day, a small party of 24 young Comanche raiders had made an ill-advised attempt at attacking the well-armed Presidio, with all but one of them being killed. The lone Comanche survivor was taken captive by the Spanish. From him, they learned of a new leader who was on the rise amongst the Comanche. The prisoner described a Katzoteca war chief whose exploits had garnered him great renown and support within his band. He seemed to know no fear, and it was believed that he had derived great medicine or puha from his distinctive buffalo-horned headdress. Accounts of the headdress vary, with descriptions of both a 2-horned version with a buffalo horn on either side or a single-horn version with the singular horn placed turned up and on the forehead. In either account, though, the horns were painted green. This garnered him the name Cuerno Verde, from the Spanish meaning greenhorn. In his work, Comanche Political History and Ethno-Historical Perspective 1708 to 1875, anthropologist Thomas Cavanaugh described the chief thusly. He had a guard of armed men, pages to help in mounting and dismounting, a sunshade of buffalo hide, as well as 2 confidants to carry out his orders, one of whom was among those killed at Ojo Caliente. The young Comanche warrior, being held prisoner, warned the Spanish time and again that his party's failure to return would lead to the tribe's assumption that the young raiding party who had gone out to raid Ojo Caliente had been killed. When they reached this conclusion, Cuerno Verde would marshal his forces and be on his way south toward this small presidio in the middle of nowhere. The day was fast approaching, he cautioned them, that Cuerno Verde would come to Ojo Caliente to take his revenge. Finally, the day arrived. Though there are no formal first-hand accounts from that morning, the routine would have been the same as all the others. Breakfasts of tortillas and beans mixed with local chilies would likely be prepared in traditional horno outdoor ovens that had been adapted by the Spanish from the local indigenous peoples, such as the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache. They may have attended a mass that morning with the priest of the presidio. The inclusion of Catholic priests on all frontier endeavors was considered mandatory by the Catholic Spanish kingdom. They would then begin checking over and donning the tools of their trade. Though their predecessors, men such as Francisco Pizarro, Juan Ponce de Leon, and Hernan Cortez, had donned elaborate, heavy metal armor, these men were clad in lighter, more flexible, and comparatively more breathable leather armor better suited to the harsh desert environs. They were known as soldados de cuera, or leather jacket soldiers. The jackets were constructed of multiple layers of deer hide that had been stitched together to form a sort of 18th century Kevlar vest. Fray Juan Crespi, a Spanish priest who served in many presidios throughout the West during this time, gives the following description of the, at the time, state-of-the-art armor. Quote, "The cuera which gave them their name was a leather jacket, like a coat without sleeves, proof against the Indians' arrows except at very close range. For additional armor they had shields and shafts. The shields, carried off the left arm, were made of 2 plies of bull's hide, and would turn either arrow or spear. The leather shafts or aprons, fashioned to the pommel of the saddle, protected legs and thighs from the brush and cactus spines." End quote. The soldados were armed with an escopeta or carbine, a pair of single-shot pistols, a bow, a sword, and a lance. As an added defensive measure, a soldado might choose between 2 types of shields, the first being the larger bullhide shield known as an adarga for use in establishing a more stationary defensive position, the second being a small round metal shield known as a rodela for use in close quarters combat. The soldados recruited heavily from the mestizo population, those of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, as well as from the natives who had come to convert to Christianity, and from freed slaves. Most of the officers, though, were full-blooded Spaniards who had been born in the New World. They were known as criollos. For both officers and enlisted men, service in the soldados presented several enticing benefits: regular pay, access to medical care, and the possibility of being granted portions of land upon completing their term of service. Recruitment was usually a local affair, as this was a much more pragmatic measure than recruiting from abroad and taking the time to acclimate troops to the harsh localities to which they would be stationed. Thus, while again the written record for the presidio at Ojo Caliente in 1768 is less than substantial, it is a safe assumption that the vast majority of the soldados present that day had been born and raised in and around the surrounding territories. But no matter how acclimated they were to the weather, nor even how accustomed their nerves were to the rigors of combat, what they saw that morning, silhouetted against the rising sun, as they were alerted by their sentries and crowded to the presidio's adobe walls to procure a better view, must have sent a collective chill down their spines. The breath of both man and beast hung in the cool morning air, as the heavy breathing of the warriors and their mounts created a mist through which their lines seemed to crash as they moved forward. Where minutes before there had been an empty horizon, now appeared 500 Comanche warriors, painted black and with minimal adornments, bearing down on the presidio at full speed. Comanche tactics, similar to other light cavalry superpowers like the Huns and Mongols, did not approach entrenched positions via linear head-on attacks. Instead, warriors would ride in tight concentric circles that rotated as they moved towards their target. As they approached, the rider nearest the target would loose their arrow, before their circular path took them to cover at the back of the circle, also affording them time to reload before finding themselves nearest the target again. This created, in effect, a giant human Gatling gun that enabled the Comanche to dwarf the rate of fire presented by the Spanish with their muzzle-loading carbines. The Comanche used short bows, again much like their Mongol and Hun predecessors half a world away, that held a draw weight well over 100 pounds. This was mitigated by the fact that they were not made to be brought to full draw with the hand holding the arrow brought below the archer's eye, but drawn back only a few inches and released in more of a shoot-from-the-hip fashion. Like the soldados, they too carried large leather shields. These, when angled properly, could and often did deflect musket balls. Also, like their soldado opponents, they carried long lances, some being documented as up to 14 feet long. These were designed to thrust into buffalo from a reasonably safe distance, but could be just as effectively wielded against human targets. Some amongst the Comanche carried carbines of their own, acquired through trading or raid, but at this time they were far less common amongst native tribes due to their unreliability and frequent need of maintenance that few, if any, natives were able to provide. Want of gunsmithing services was so prevalent, in fact, that it would be worked into many treaties with the United States and Mexican governments as a necessary term of agreement. Even the relatively well-trained and well-equipped soldados could, at best, hope to get off 2 to 4 rounds a minute from their carbines. However, with the added advantage of their organization, tactics, and substantial cover provided by the Presidio walls, this would be a hard-fought fight for both parties. As the soldados took up their positions and steadied their arms, waiting for their officer's command to fire, they surveyed the battlefield that lay before them, in the barren hinterlands of today's New Mexico. Even in the early morning's fleeting illumination, one figure amongst the seemingly demonic horde barreling at them stood out amongst the rest. He was not an exceptionally large man, but his demeanor and body language indicated that he was clearly in command of this band of warriors, and the green-horned headdress that he wore, beneath which his eyes burned intently and angrily, indicated that this was Cuerno Verde. As the arrows began to rain down, and the Comanche war party advanced upon them in several of their cyclonic attack formations, the soldados loosened their initial volley at the command of their officer. Everyone inside the Presidio was well aware of the stakes at hand. Should they be overrun, those among them who were not killed outright would suffer torturous deaths at the hands of the Comanche. Again and again, the soldados repeated the actions of firing and reloading their carbines, their well-trained digits struggling with the numbing effects of the morning chill. The din of gunfire, commanders' exhortations, war cries, and the lamentations of the wounded and dying filled the air, along with the acrid aroma of gunsmoke. Meanwhile, Cuerno Verde continued his relentless press towards the Presidio, urging his warriors on and darting from formation to formation, loosing arrows all the while reports of his treatment amongst his people as a little king were likely to have been exaggerated by his enemies seeking to paint him as a haughty war chief. Cuerno Verde was indeed a fierce warrior, one who had earned the respect of his people through the only means available to any young Comanche man: prowess on the battlefield. Cuerno Verde had not only survived in this harsh, Spartan-esque world, he had thrived in it. His wife was happy and well-fed. His young son was fast becoming the apparent rightful heir to his father's legacy, and the warriors who had followed him on this raid, all 500 of them, trusted him implicitly with their lives. Cuerno Verde likely did view himself as less of a king, but more of a distinguished member of a collective empire that had been built by the Comanche and was inherently theirs to uphold, defend, and expand. These Spanish, like the Apache, Navajo, and Ute they had also warred with over the years, were not of his people, and thus had no right on his land. And, for the crime of killing dozens of their young warriors over the past year, he intended that these interlopers pay with their lives. Cuerno Verde's blood ran hot, his blood soaking the cap of his buffalo hide headdress, and as he came nearer and nearer the Presidio walls, he could almost feel the will of the Spanish breaking. Then, from an unknown soldado, a shot rang out. Cuerno Verde was struck in the chest by a Spanish bullet and fell from his horse. For a brief instant, a shocked silence seemed to fall over the whole of the battlefield. Then, almost as suddenly, a collective howl went up amongst the warriors, as all present turned in retreat. To the Comanche, the killing of a war chief meant the medicine behind the raid had gone bad. Seeing Cuerno Verde fall was evidence that his raid no longer had divine favor, and that a retreat must be made. But while the Comanche code of conduct made no provisions for the sacrificing of warriors to obtain positions solely for the position's sake, they were renowned, even in 1768, for their willingness to put themselves in harm's way in order to recover the bodies of their slain warriors if at all possible. In this instance, Cuerno Verde's compatriots were able to make off with his lifeless body, headdress still intact. They disappeared over the horizon, and the Spanish, aware of the common tactic of false retreats baiting pursuers into ambushes, saw fit to ensconce themselves even more firmly within the walls of the Presidio. As the soldados used the time to refortify their positions, to send word to Taos for any available reinforcements, the Comanche made their way north, again onto the open plains of today's Colorado. When they arrived back at their camp, carrying the body of the slain Cuerno Verde, a collective wail rose up amongst the entirety of those present, as the loss of such a great war chief was so keenly felt. What was worse, it had come at the hands of the newest, most hubristic intruders into their empire, the leather-clad and carbine-wielding Spanish. Cuerno Verde's horses, a Comanche chief of his status would likely have at least a few hundred, were all killed by hand, being sent with him to the afterworld to continue serving their master. As was their obligation, Cuerno Verde's widow was taken care of by the families of his warriors. Cuerno Verde's son would also take up his obligation, one of revenge. His father had named him Tabibo Narikant, meaning dangerous man, and while this was certainly apt, history would see him assume the mantle of his father in avenging his death. In a few short years, the soldados would again shudder at the sight of a mighty, green-horned warrior rushing down upon them with fury untold. Unsure at first whether or not the mighty warrior had been killed at all, or maybe even returned from the dead, they would begin to refer to him under the same moniker as they had his father. He would be known as Cuerno Verde, and it would be he who history would recall as such, as his legend would spread farther and wider than even his legendary fathers. Tales all over the Spanish settlements in what is now New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas told of the brutality and violence wrought by the war chief against whose very existence implied support for the killing of his beloved father. The Spanish would pursue him in vain for years, until a legendary figure of their own, a man named Juan Bautista de Anza, came to the territory. In 1776, he had led an expedition to Alta California and helped found what is today San Francisco. Upon his return to the territory, he was made aware of the havoc being unleashed by Cuerno Verde and his raiders, and made it his mission to track them down. It would be years later before they would finally meet on the plains of Colorado. In the intervening time, he would lead expeditions over thousands of miles. Cuerno Verde would continue his quest for revenge via years of horrifically violent warfare, and the Comanche as a whole would be devastated by the deadliest enemy any native tribe could encounter: smallpox. The intervening decade would see the Comanche devastated, the Spanish Empire reformed, and the fate of nations changed forever. But those, like countless other stories from Comanche and Spanish history, are other stories for other times. On June 20th, 1837, William IV, King of England, died at the age of 71. His successor, Queen Victoria, would go on to reign for 63 years and 7 months, longer than any of her predecessors. The entire era of her reign would be known to history as the Victorian era. But that same month, 4,500 miles away, a group of young men gathered in a buffalo hide teepee in the middle of the night on the desolate, sweltering prairie. These young men were Cheyenne warriors, members of the Bowstring Society. They did not know, nor could they be bothered to care about the death of the King of England. Their concern, as they gathered on that sweltering night, was the stealing of horses. Or, perhaps more accurately, they were in a heated discussion about the decided lack of raiding they had been doing. These were young warriors, out to build their wealth and reputation. And the only way to do that in a culture such as the Cheyenne was raiding other tribes. Their intended target was an encampment of Kiowas, Comanches, and Lipan Apache who were encamped on the Texas Panhandle. Their Southern Plains counterparts, particularly the Kiowa and Comanche, were exponentially wealthier than they in terms of horseflesh. This, combined with the recent inability to get along between the Cheyenne and Kiowa, was the perfect pretense under which to launch a horse-stealing raid. However, they were being held back. White Thunder, the 70-year-old medicine man and elder known amongst this band of Cheyenne as the Keeper of the Arrows, would not allow it. There had been a murder amongst the Cheyenne, and no raids could be conducted until White Thunder, according to his position as Keeper of the Arrows, performed a cleansing ceremony. White Thunder insisted that not enough time had passed, not enough good signs had been accrued from the Great Spirit in order to justify the ceremony yet. But the young Cheyenne, members of one of the many martial societies among the Cheyenne known as the Bowstring Society, were militantly insistent. When White Thunder would not acquiesce to their verbal demands, they beat him with their quirts until he finally agreed, bruised and bloodied, to perform the ceremony. Once the ceremony was complete, the young warriors of the Bowstring Society began to outfit themselves for raiding and battle. But, White Thunder warned them, the coerced cleansing would not have the desired effect. The Bowstring warriors, young and haughty, paid him no mind. He was a foolish old man in their minds, too superstitious and self-important to be of any real use in their endeavors. But when they visited their neighbors and long-trusted allies, the Arapaho, they were shocked to find no takers on their offer to join the raiding party. The Arapaho were in the middle of their Sundance, and warned their friends the Cheyenne that their medicine men had seen visions of great destruction and desolation for any warriors who attempted a raid at this cosmically inopportune time. But this all amounted to so much cowardice in the minds of the young Cheyenne warriors. They were fearless members of the Bowstring Society, after all. They were not afraid of danger and would embrace it as a necessary means in garnering their ultimate ends. They, like young men everywhere throughout history, were willing to risk it all to acquire women, riches, and respect. And so, against the wishes of their tribal elders, 38 of the Bowstring Society and 4 members of another Cheyenne warrior society known as the Contraries slipped out of their camp near the headwaters of the Arkansas River in the middle of the night and made their way south towards their intended target in what is today far northwest Texas. By the time they managed to come within striking distance of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan Apache camp, they were not so much the picture of fearless raiding warriors as they were exhausted, starving, and unnerved young men who were becoming increasingly ill at ease with the continued setbacks of their grand plans. Still determined not to return home empty-handed, they carried on with their plan of attack. They sent 2 scouts ahead of their main party to scout the Kiowa village. In another unfortuitous turn, the scouts ran into a young Kiowa who had wandered from the camp in search of good branches with which to construct arrows. Initially, the young boy thought they were returning Kiowa hunters and bid them hello from afar. The Cheyenne scouts shot arrows at him in response, but missed, and the boy was able to escape to the village and sound the alarm. Now, things had gone from bad to worse for the young Cheyenne warriors. They were rapidly turning from hunter to hunted, and with this unexpected turn and no solid, experienced leadership, they were unsure what to do. Within minutes, The Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan braves of the village were fanning out in a large, armed, angry, and slightly confused search party. They would not have to search for long. The warriors of the Bowstring Society, low on arrows due to exhausting them in attempts to procure game, had quickly come to the realization that their miscalculations may have indeed been fatal. They had hastily constructed rock walls at the end of the ravine the creek ran into and draped thick buffalo hides over these in an attempt to provide themselves some sort of bulwark against the assault to come. With visions of returning home victorious horse barons now all but flickering memories, the warriors of the Bowstring Society were now faced with the stark reality of their situation. They could hear the Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan coming, their horses' hoofbeats thundering up the ravine as their riders let out ever more vociferous war whoops. Then, the two parties were in sight of each other, and, all of a sudden, as murderous indignation met resolute defiance, there was awkward confusion. The Kiowa and their allies were unsure just exactly who they were trailing or what exactly was going on. Then they saw the hastily constructed breastworks and could only make out shadowy figures behind them. They called out and asked who these figures were and what they wanted in these lands. After a painfully pregnant pause, the young Cheyenne let loose their own war whoops, showing themselves and pounding their chests and dancing and singing their death songs. They shouted at the Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan warriors present, daring their pursuers to come on. For the warriors of the Bowstring Society, there was nothing left to do but make one last desperate stand. And this they did. They fired off every arrow they had, then unsheathed their knives and tomahawks and took to vicious hand-to-hand combat. There was no concession in plains warfare, especially amongst grown men. Fights were to the death, and anyone who surrendered could expect only a longer, far more torturous demise. The Cheyenne managed to kill 6 more Kiowa in the vicious hand-to-hand fighting that followed, but eventually, before too long, every Cheyenne present, all 42 of them, lie dead in the bottom of that ravine in the most desolate reaches of the frontier. The Kiowa, Comanche, and Lipan Apache would scalp all 42 and reportedly line all their bodies up along the walls of their impromptu defenses as a warning to any other prospective horse thieves. Years later, when a Kiowa named Stumbling Bear, who had been present that day, visited the site of the battle, he reported that all the skeletons still sat where they had left them, all in a row. It would be several months before the Cheyenne village would find out what happened to their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers. An Arapaho who had been at a nearby trading post heard the news from some Kiowas there and made his way back to the Cheyenne as fast as possible to let them know the terrible news. The grief and rage would tear through the Cheyenne camps like wildfire. They were incensed at the deaths and scalping of their kinsmen and compatriots, and determined to secure their revenge. This they would do a whole year later at a battle in northwest Oklahoma that would be one of the most terrible, most consequential intertribal conflicts between the largest tribes on the plains. But for tonight, that's another story for another time. Klamath Lake, Oregon, May 9th, 1846. In the middle of the night, a group of mountain men lie in much-deserved sleep after a hard day's travel of roughly 60 miles through the rugged terrain of southern Oregon. Their party, 14 strong, is composed of experienced mountain men from a variety of background. Included among them are 3 native Delaware tribesmen, as well as the French descendant, St. Louis-born Basil Lajeunesse. They are led by John C. Fremont, a former U.S. Army cartographer who has, by means of both merit and a powerful father-in-law, managed to secure himself a congressional appointment to explore the American West. For the better part of the 1840s, he has conducted exploratory missions throughout the West. However, much of the territory he is exploring does not belong to the United States. It, in fact, belongs to Mexico. Though fur trappers, traders, sailors, and whalers have been finding their way to California by sea or by overland crossing for decades now, the territory of Northern California is still, at this point in 1846, relatively unknown and uninhabited. It is owned, ostensibly, by Mexico, as it had been owned by the Spanish before. But in reality, neither government has invested much in the way of resources towards settling the wild lands that lay to the north and to the east of the mission systems that hug the coastline. By and large, this area of Northern California and Oregon is, in fact, under the control of the tribes who have long ruled their respective areas of domain from the San Joaquin Valley to the Cascade Mountains. This meant that the ruling government's headquarters, thousands of miles away in Mexico City, was of little to no use to the Mexican citizens inhabiting the area. However, the land was bountiful, and, at a time when the population was scarcely more than a few thousand people in Northern California, plentiful and ready for the taking by any settler with means and intentions to do so. As was the case in Texas a decade earlier, this openness and availability has drawn a fair amount of American farmers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs. The lack of regulation from the Mexican government provides an enticing prospect for those who have, as of yet, been unable to secure a plot of land and sustain a livelihood elsewhere. The vast, open swaths of ungoverned and unsettled territory also draws the interest of the United States government. Since the expedition of Lewis and Clark 4 decades earlier, the national adherence to the doctrine of manifest destiny has become increasingly vociferous. As the desire for a continent-spanning nation has become more and more apparent amongst the voting public, and the outcry for greater settlement begins to trickle in from Americans living in Northern California, President John Tyler, and then his successor James K. Polk, begin to take increasing interest in wresting the territory from Mexico. But first, the United States must have a better understanding of the territory they hope to overtake and annex. Thus, the services of John C. Fremont have been enlisted on a number of exploratory jaunts that have seen the inveterate, well-connected explorer cover vast swaths of the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas, not to mention numerous trips through deserts and to the Pacific coastline. Fremont now finds himself here, on the shoreline of the vast Klamath Lake, on yet another excursion being undertaken under the decidedly odd pretense of exploring a country that is not his to explore. Now, it seems another layer is being added to this mission by James K. Polk himself. In the week prior, Fremont's company had been surprised on the trail by a hurried, breathless U.S. Marine lieutenant named Archibald Gillespie. Lieutenant Gillespie had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, materializing from amidst the hulking redwoods like a travel-weary specter. Though his presence seems a curious novelty to most of these men, he brings news of great import for Fremont. Gillespie has been dispatched by President James K. Polk himself, with messages for the American consuls in Los Angeles as well as for John Fremont. After making his way from Washington, D.C. to Mexico and then taking a ship to Los Angeles, Gillespie was informed that Fremont's expedition was on its way north, hundreds of miles ahead of him. Gillespie had made an incredible effort through environments that his training as a Marine in the 1830s had not prepared him for, in order to catch up to Fremont and Company and deliver the secret messages. What the messages say will be lost to history, but it is thought to concern Fremont's involvement in the coming efforts to annex California for the United States. The men in Fremont's company are unsure of the exact nature of the correspondence, but are sure that they now find their leader in a fitfully distracted state. He had conferred with Gillespie late into the night as he pored over the letters. He had been so assured of their safety and so ensconced in his new business at hand with Gillespie that Fremont had given all the men license to sleep freely, without posting a guard. While many in the party had seen this as a welcome relief, one man does not. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. At 37 years old, he is not only a legendary mountain man, but has become an inadvertent pop culture figure. All across the eastern seaboard and the big cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., men, women, and children alike delighted in reading the dime novels replete with highly fictionalized accounts of his daring and expertise. Though Carson is the first to dispel any notion of his own celebrity, his renown is certainly not without cause. He has seen more of the continent than almost any man living at this time. He has traded, fought, and even married into local tribes on the Great Plains and in the vast Southwest. He has survived all manner of privation, hardship, and danger for over 2 decades in locales from the Rocky Mountains to the city of Los Angeles to the sun-drenched prairies of Kansas. He has spent over a decade as a mountain man in the company of legendary trappers such as Bill Williams, Jim Bridger, and Ewing Young. He had married an Arapaho woman named Singing Grass, and the couple had had 2 children. However, in 1839, Singing Grass had died of complications during labor, leaving Carson to care for 2 young daughters. He had remarried to a Cheyenne woman named Making Out Road, but the marriage had ended quickly in divorce, and his children had not been welcome. In April of 1842, after his youngest daughter, whose name is unknown, was killed in a tragic accident after falling into a vat of boiling soap, Carson had decided to bring his surviving daughter to Missouri to stay with relatives. While on a steamboat on the Missouri River, he was recognized by John C. Fremont, who engaged the vaunted frontiersman in conversation and convinced him to sign on as a guide for his new scientific expedition. Carson soon found himself again headed west, providing navigation and direction for Fremont's party. Over the course of the next few years, the 2 men and their small company would traverse vast expanses of the American West. By 1846, they have already made 2 expeditions and accumulated thousands of miles. By all accounts, Carson has been, time and again, the party's saving grace from certain disaster. However, Carson, despite his notoriety and confidence in his own skills, is a man keenly aware of his own limitations. He is a man from a poor family, and for all intents and purposes, illiterate. His natural inclination, despite his authority and experience and aptitude, is to defer the burden of leadership to the wealthy, well-connected, and well-educated Fremont. So, earlier in this evening, as the men had eaten dinner and prepared their beds, Carson had dutifully obliged to Fremont's decision not to post a guard for the evening. But as much as Carson's mind had prevented him from verbalizing his concerns to his boss, his nerves, acclimated to constant sensitivity from a life spent on the trail, will not let him sleep soundly. Carson feels assured that the party is indeed vulnerable to attack. In the weeks prior to their arrival at Klamath Lake, Fremont, Carson, and company had been involved in a number of skirmishes with natives throughout the Northern California area. The most notable of these being the Wintu Massacre, also known as the Sacramento River Massacre. In late March of 1846, the Fremont party had arrived at the Lassen Ranch in the northern Sacramento Valley, only to be informed by settlers they believed a native attack upon them was imminent. Taking them at their word, and eager to seize an opportunity to both pad his military record as well as to instill some measure of intimidation into the surrounding natives, Fremont headed out in search of the native forces said to be amassing nearby. Under his charge were 60 Americans, including the trappers in his party, as well as, quote, 9 Delaware Indians, 2 California Indians, and 5 members of a nearby trading post. On April 5th, they had come upon a large camp of the Wintu people. Though this was indeed a large settlement, there was no indication that the people within were in the process of marshaling any sort of assault upon the settlers in the area. However, Fremont saw their sheer number and presence in the area as sufficient cause to order an attack. The village was set upon from 3 sides by the forces under Fremont's command. Thomas Breckinridge, a member of Fremont's exploratory party and present at the incident, gave the following account. The order was given to ask no quarter and to give none. The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. Estimates of the number of Wintu people killed in the attack range from 150 to 700, with many drowning or being shot as they fled into the river. Word had spread quickly among all tribes of Northern California and Oregon of the great massacre inflicted upon the native people, perpetrated by the dark-haired, long-bearded officer and his party of mountain men. Though seemingly untroubled by the butchery, as he had so often been privy to in his life on the frontier, Carson is all too keenly aware of the potential consequences such actions might incur. Sometime after midnight, his wire-tight nerves snapped Carson out of his shallow slumber. Amidst the lapping of waves on the lake shore, the crackling of coals in the campfire, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, an odd, dull thumping noise causes his eyes to snap open, and immediately surveil the campsite. With only the light of the campfire to illuminate the scene, Carson can at first find nothing amiss. Then his eyes settle on the oddly contorted position in which his good friend Basil La Jeunesse is sleeping. "What's the matter over there, Basil?" Carson inquires. Then he notices an odd glistening of the firelight off La Jeunesse's head and torso. Within seconds, the situation is clear to the experienced mountain man. His friend has been killed, bludgeoned by a native warrior's club, and the camp is under attack. Carson, the first in the camp to awake to this horror, calls out, "Indians!" and fires his pistol into the darkness. As Carson's cry is still echoing off the trees surrounding them, the other men are awakened. Lucian Maxwell, Alex Godey, and Dick Owens, all longtime friends and compatriots of Carson's, now have their pistols and tomahawks drawn, eyes searching the night, seeking any kind of available cover. Arrows whistle by them, thudding into the tree trunks as dark figures whirl about just outside the light of the fire. A Delaware tracker known as Crane grabs a rifle and attempts to fire into the darkness, but it is either unloaded or misfires. As a few attacking warriors dash through the camp, Crane attempts to club them with his now otherwise useless firearm. In his fury, he becomes unaware of his position in front of the fire, making him a well-illuminated target for his attackers. Moments after being exposed by the light of the fire, Crane's torso is filled with arrows, and he falls dead. As Carson's eyes sweep the campsite, he hears a loud, guttural moan from his right. Looking over his shoulder, he sees the motionless body of Denny, his good friend and a much-beloved Delaware tracker. Turning his attention again towards the center of the camp, hoping to catch some of the attacking warriors in the same firelight that had doomed the Delaware Crane, Carson sees a lone warrior, resplendent in full war paint and headdress, standing his ground in the middle of the camp, fighting with unabashed fury. With a fine steel tomahawk, he cuts and slashes at the camp defenders, exhorting the other attackers with his war cries. Carson presumes this to be the chief, as do the other experienced mountain men in the party. The next volley of shots from their rifles and pistols renders the attacking chief no more, as he too falls next to the flickering campfire. For the bulk of the next hour, the attacking warriors make repeated, though seemingly haphazard, attacks upon the campsite, hoping to reclaim the body of their fallen leader. Eventually, the attacks abate, and the survivors spend the next few hours in a pensive state, waiting for another assault to materialize from the darkness. Finally, the sun begins to peek over the craggy mountains surrounding the lake. Some of the men set about laying blankets over the bodies of Denny, Crane, and La Jeunesse as Carson and Fremont examine the fallen chief. He is, Carson is sure, a Klamath, a people he has derided before as a mean, low-life, and treacherous race. The chief, now cold in death, his ornate war bonnet crumpled by his last fall, is covered in jagged designs of bright war paint. Carson would later recall him to be the bravest Indian I ever saw. But in this moment, as his comrades lie strewn in death on the ground around him, Carson is overcome with an unconquerable mix of grief and rage. As his eyes blur and his nostrils flare, he deliberately takes the tomahawk, secured to the chief's wrist with a leather thong, from its owner. For a few moments, Carson examines the weapon with the curiosity and awe of a seasoned cultural anthropologist. The weapon is heavy-headed, but well-balanced, the handle sitting nicely in the palm, and its blade razor-sharp. Then, in a sudden torrent of rage that shocks Fremont and the newcomer Gillespie, Carson raises the weapon up and powerfully, repeatedly, smashes it into the face and head of the fallen chief. Again and again, the blows rain down, until the chief's head is, by Carson's later estimation, all knocked to pieces. When his grief is momentarily satiated, Carson confers with Fremont as to the next course of action. Revenge, both agree, must be the order of the day. First, though, there is the business of burying their comrades. The 3 dead men are wrapped in blankets and strapped sideways onto their horses. Fremont and Carson initially planned to bury their friends at a scenic spot on the lake shore. However, as they travel in search of a suitable location, the bodies of the dead men are repeatedly bludgeoned and knocked off of their mounts by the numerous trees that obfuscate any clear path through the territory. Soon, the bodies are bruised, and the task becomes so distasteful that the company of men decide that their unfortunate cohorts must be buried on the spot in the cold, rocky soil of the forest. As a few of the men stand guard, the remainder claw at the ground with their knives, eventually digging out a singular, shallow grave big enough for 3. The men are buried with little ceremony but the prayers of their comrades, and covered with logs and rocks in order to ward off predators. With their comrades now buried, the men's grief and rage runs unfettered. Their first order of business now is to find any Klamath that they can and exact retribution upon them. Their Delaware scouts, after completing their own burial rituals for their fallen comrades, are the first to head out into the silent labyrinth of trees in search of any lingering Klamath. They are gone only a short time when they reappear, this time each holding a freshly taken scalp. "Was sick, better now," one said. The Delaware, Carson, and a small group then head up the Klamath Lake shoreline, scouting for a larger village. About 10 miles ahead of Fremont and the remainder of the men, Carson and the company stumble upon a large village of Klamath. They, too, are quickly spotted by the Klamath, whose women and children scatter in all directions as the men in the village race to arm themselves, and those who had been out fishing hurriedly beach their canoes in a rush to reach their weapons and fellow defenders. With the element of surprise lost, Carson and his men must now make an immediate attack, which they do, with another massacre ensuing. Though accounts vary, with Carson insisting that no women or children were killed, at least one old woman was found among the dead. The huts of the villages are set ablaze, which Carson deems a beautiful sight to behold. As smoke and flames engulf the village, Fremont, disappointed to have missed out on the action, gallops into the camp with the rest of his men. Though he has been unable to catch up to Carson in time for the attack, it will be only a matter of hours until Fremont can claim a coup of his own. As Carson is surveying the destruction wrought by his small attacking band on this, the largest Klamath village in the area, a lone warrior returns and, seeing what has occurred in his absence, draws an arrow aimed directly at Carson. The sudden motion catches Carson's eye, and he draws his pistol and squeezes the trigger, but the weapon misfires. Fremont, a few yards away, spots the Klamath taking aim and spurs his powerful gray warhorse, Sacramento, at the man, trampling him under hoof. The lone Klamath is then pounced upon by a Delaware named Segunde and bludgeoned to death with a war club. Though Carson's allegiance to Fremont has thus far been unwavering, this incident will forever instill an unflagging obedience to the Army officer that will carry on for the rest of Carson's life. Now, as the Klamath village lies in destruction, with Klamath warriors strewn about the ground in their final repose, Carson again confers with Fremont as to their next move. He is informed that they must now, with the advent of the information brought in the top-secret letters by the Marine Archibald Gillespie, return to California. There is a rebellion on against the Mexican government, and Fremont, Carson, and company will all play a pivotal role. The party heads south, leaving the Klamath village to burn and the survivors to mourn. The village is never rebuilt, and the survivors scatter to other bands. Though they have been held accountable by Fremont and Carson for the deaths of their friends, many experts today believe that the Klamath had, in fact, been innocent of any involvement in the attack on the Americans' camp. Instead, it is now believed that the offending tribe had been the Modoc, a culturally related but longtime enemy of the Klamath people. It does not seem that Carson was terribly concerned with the deeds of himself and his men that day as, in his later account, he would deem it a perfect butchery. Carson, though, already a famous figure, will go on to cement his legend in the coming decades, as will Fremont. Few figures in American history have been as consequential as these two men, and their deeds will, for better or worse, carry great weight for years well after their deaths. The stories of exploration, navigation, adventure, survival, combat, and killing seem almost too numerous to tell, and though rest assured, History at the OK Corral will do our best to tell them all, for tonight, they are other stories for other times. The Tunstall Ranch, Lincoln County, New Mexico, February 18, 1878. John Tunstall lays dead on the grounds of his cattle ranch, shot twice through the chest and once through the head, the victim of a cold-blooded execution at the hands of a posse sent to take cattle for a debt payment by Sheriff William Brady. Tunstall, a native of Hackney, London, England, had ventured to the American West with designs on earning a fortune in industry. He had joined with Alexander McSween, a lawyer of Scottish descent born in Canada. They ventured together to compete with Lincoln County's primary business, the House, a dry goods store that supplied the region and did significant business in the cattle trade. Having procured large government contracts to provide beef to the U.S. Army and Native American reservations. The incursion into their profitable empire was not welcomed by the proprietors of the House, namely James Dolan and Sheriff Brady. Things would take a violent turn when McSween interjected himself in a matter of an insurance settlement upon the death of one of the House's largest customers who owed a significant debt to the operation. McSween secured the payment for the policy, but refused to turn it over, fearing it would go to pay the debt to his cash-strapped competition in the House. A judgment was issued against McSween, and Sheriff Brady began to attach McSween's property to pay it off. He went above and beyond the amount needed for the satisfaction of the debt, and even roped his partner Tunstall into the mix by attaching his cattle. The sheriff's posse that had been sent to the Tunstall ranch to procure the cattle had come into contact with John Tunstall alone, who had been separated from the rest of his party, who had been busy herding the livestock. A vanguard of the posse had encountered Tunstall when he was on his own on a trail leading to Ruidoso just 4 miles to the north. With Tunstall had been Billy the Kid, Dick Brewer, John Middleton, and others, but they were too far separated from Tunstall to see his encounter with the posse. John Middleton heard the exchange of gunfire, and upon heading down to the location of Tunstall's encounter with the posse, saw him lying prone with his head covered with a blanket, and cried out, "They have killed Tunstall." The fateful mid-February day in this picturesque, elevated mountain terrain of southern New Mexico was starkly contrasted with the scene of a vicious act of retribution in the murder of John Tunstall. Sheriff Brady would officially claim that John Tunstall had fired on the posse while positioned directly in front of them, and that he had been killed when the posse had returned fire. This account appeared highly improbable to the friends and kin who knew John Tunstall as a mild-mannered and thoughtful man. At 11 o'clock that night, Billy the Kid and Robert Weidman reached Lincoln with the news of the killing. Tensions immediately grew high amongst the townspeople, as this escalation in the feud between McSween and the House would certainly beget more bloodshed. 60 men gathered at McSween's house to hear the story of the Tunstall Ranch, and to give him their reassurance that he would be supported in his desire for justice. The sentiments of the locals had shifted so strongly in support of McSween that Dolan grew concerned. Had they simply taken McSween's property as they had been given court authority to do, they could have diminished their primary competition, and perhaps even caused them to withdraw from Lincoln County. Now, they were engaged in a bitter feud that could endanger not only their business interests, but even their lives. In order to carry out the arrest of those responsible for the killing, Tunstall's allies and friends formed a group known as the Regulators. While the Regulators had at various times existed with dozens of American and Mexican cowboys, the core of the membership were known as the Ironclad. Included in this were Dick Brewer, Frank McNabb, Doc Scurlock, Jim French, and the man who found Tunstall's expired body, John Middleton. The party would also include the notorious William Henry Bonney, also known as Billy the Kid. The Regulators were deputized by the Lincoln County Justice of the Peace, and on March 1st, Dick Brewer was appointed town constable. They were to bring in the men wanted for the killing of Tunstall. The Regulators had begun as a vigilante mob, but were now operating under the authority of the law. Dick Brewer sought to deliver the killers to justice, and not to make a scene of further chaos and death if it could be so avoided. They intended to deliver the suspects to be held until trial at the next term of court just 4 weeks away. News arrived in Lincoln that many of the individuals involved in the killing of John Tunstall were down on the Pecos River at Dolan and Riley's cow camp. Brewer gathered the Regulators together and rode out of town with haste. They would reach the Pecos on March 4th. They spent the next 2 days scouting the area and their diligence would pay off when they discovered a few of the men suspected in the Tunstall murder. Just below the crossing on the Rio Penasco, Brewer and company jumped a party of 5 men that scattered into 2 groups, William Morton, Frank Baker, and Sam Lloyd in one, and 2 other men in the other. Dick Brewer was quick to recognize Morton and Baker and determined to make them the primary target of their operation. Brewer and his men chased the 3 murder suspects in a grueling 6-mile pursuit that was tantamount to a running fight, with bullets being exchanged at one another and horses pressed to their absolute breaking point. Sam Lloyd's horse gave out, and as he was moments from being overtaken by the posse of regulators, Brewer continued the chase and left him behind, focused now upon Baker and Morton, the primary men responsible for the execution of John Tunstall. At long last, the horses of Morton and Baker gave out near one another, and the men then prepared to make their final stand in a recess in the terrain, covered by thick tule. After a tense standoff, Morton and Baker agreed to come out. Morton was the leader of the small detachment of the Brady posse that had engaged Tunstall and killed him. Baker was part of another group, but one that was also directly tied to the killing. Brewer swore they would not face retribution from his men, and that they simply intended to deliver them up to trial. Billy the Kid openly took exception to Brewer's intentions, stating, "Dick, we've 2 of them and they're the worst of the lot. Let's avenge John Tunstall by killing them right here and now." Dick Brewer again deferred on this opportunity for frontier justice, and they set off towards Lincoln with the prisoners in tow. The capture of the 2 men had not occurred until it was nearly dusk, so the party decided to make camp for the night at a cow camp on John Chisholm's ranch. The next day, they embarked upon a significantly longer stretch of the journey, traveling all the way to the headquarters of Chisholm's ranch at the South Spring River. They made their camp there on the night of Thursday, March 8th. Concern grew amongst Brewer's men in regards to the reception they would be given upon their arrival in Lincoln. Everything they had done thus far was in accordance with the law under the blessing of the Justice of the Peace, as they were executing a warrant for the arrest of murder suspects. But by bringing in 2 prisoners so closely connected to Dolan and the house, wouldn't turning the prisoners over to his primary ally in Sheriff Brady simply negate the work they had just undertaken? And what sort of revenge could they expect from Dolan and Brady's men once they simply freed Baker and Morton? These deliberations amongst the party took a dark turn when news arrived from Lincoln to their camp that Dolan had gathered a group of men, numbering some 20 or more, and was sending them to cut off Brewer's party on the road to Lincoln and engage them by whatever means it took to secure the release of Morton and Baker. This changed the demeanor of Brewer's party significantly. If these reports were true, they may be walking into an ambush that could bring about significant loss of life and the fumbling of the highly sought fugitives. The number of men under Brewer's supervision that wanted to take matters into their own hands had just grown exponentially. But there was one particular member of Brewer's posse that further complicated matters. William McCloskey had presented himself to the group as someone who was sympathetic to their cause. He had been employed by Tunstall on a temporary basis and had what could be described as friendly relations with the bulk of Brewer's men. The caveat was that McCloskey had been a member of the posse that had come to attach the cattle to the McSween debt the day Tunstall was slain, although McCloskey was not in the small contingent of men with Morton and Baker who carried out the execution. This fact brought him much distrust from the other men. Rumors amongst them began to spread that he was a spy, and maybe attempting to divulge their plans to Dolan and his men. The whispers grew louder amongst the men of their suspicions for McCloskey, and the concern for the danger they faced from Dolan's ambush grew into extreme and palpable anxiety that had quickly overtaken the camp. Brewer gave Morton the opportunity to write a letter to a relative in Virginia that night. The letter would foreshadow the shocking turn of events that was soon to unfold. Within the long letter, Morton began an explanation of the job he had been sent on, attaching property in the service of a debt, as well as his version of events that Tunstall had fired upon him and his men first, that the fire had been returned, and thus Tunstall had been killed. He recounts his arrest, being fired upon by 100 rounds as the Brewer posse gave chase, and his concern that they may be intending to kill him. He wrote, "I have heard that we're not to be taken alive to that place. I am not at all afraid of their killing me, but if they should do so, I wish that the matter should be investigated and the parties dealt with according to the law. If you do not hear from me in 4 days after receipt of this, I would like you to make inquiries about the affair." The following morning, just after 10 o'clock, the Brewer party headed out from the Chisholm Ranch. They traveled ahead roughly 10 miles on the road to Lincoln, then, unexpectedly, they changed course and headed north. They had rerouted using a seldom traveled path to Lincoln that swung out almost to the foot of the Capitan Mountains before turning back towards Lincoln. Should Dolan have stationed a contingent of men upon the primary road into Lincoln, this alternate route had surely circumvented his plans. It also served to lengthen their journey, and it would provide the cover of nightfall for their arrival in Lincoln. As they pressed on through the mountainous region, the party had drifted into further splits from one another in their travels. While they trekked their way through the Blackwater Canyon, Brewer, from his position near the rear of the convoy, heard a series of gunshots echoing through the gorge from just up ahead. An unsettling series of possibilities flashed through his mind on what he thought could be the cause, and while his thoughts feared the worst, he spurred his horse hard and sprinted forward to the front of the line. His fears were realized when he came upon the fresh corpses of Morton, Baker, and McCloskey. Morton's body had been peppered with 9 bullets, all delivered into his back. The account Brewer was given by his men was that Morton had been riding in front with McCloskey, grabbed his pistol, and shot him with it. Morton and Baker then raced forth to escape and were cut down in the process. This story was as unbelievable as the account given by Morton in regards to the cold-blooded execution of John Tunstall, if not more so. Dolan's faction would spread reports of the event in a different way. McCloskey had declared himself to be the neutral party and that he would protect the prisoners until they could be turned over in Lincoln, and that after doing so, he had been shot, and the other men executed while on their knees, begging for their lives. The truth about the events that occurred just a few hundred yards ahead of Brewer that late winter day in Blackwater Canyon are still unclear. But what is undeniable is that what occurred served to greatly increase hostilities, and soon also the body count, in the ongoing blood feud that has come to be known as the Lincoln County War. But the tales of ruthlessness and retribution that hold the truth and consequences of the New Mexican mountains are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.